So I think we'll go
ahead. Sorry, Chair Wall, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to all of you, including those of you who are tuning in online to listen and follow this issue. I'm Mary Wall, Chair of the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission. And today what we're doing is continuing the joint Washington-Oregon discussions about the Columbia River resources that we jointly manage. This is our chance to focus on the profoundly important Columbia River Basin and its resources. We hope to have a few of those meetings, so Chair Carpenter and I are alternating. I'll chair this one, you'll chair again next time. So I'll first just stop for a second and ask each of the Washington and Oregon commissioners and the department directors to introduce themselves. And there will be several staff presenting. We'll ask them to introduce themselves when they present, but if we could start with the Washington chair.
Thank you, Chair Wall. I'm happy to be on here. I want to thank everybody in advance for their participation in a very, very critical and necessary discussion. And it's going to be my pleasure to see Guy Norman again today. I haven't seen him for a while, but I've been seeing him for decades. So I look forward to that. So thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Commissioner, Vice Chair from Washington, if you'll introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. This is Barbara Baker, Vice Chair of the Washington Fish and Wildlife Committee. I'm also glad to be here. I hope we get some work done today.
We will. Oregon Vice Chair, will you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Chair Wall. I'm Greg Woolley. I'm Vice Chair of the Oregon Commission. I represent Congressional District 3, which includes the Portland metro area and surrounding areas.
Thank you. Washington Commissioners Anderson and McIsaac, will you introduce yourselves, please?
This is Jim Anderson, Commissioner from Washington. I'm glad to be here. Looking forward to the day.
Thank you. Commissioner.
Yes, thank you, Chair Wall. And let me echo also the appreciation for the efforts of the commissioners and the staff in bringing this meeting together. It is an important matter that we move forward toward policy and concurrency at the commission and department levels, as you've indicated. And this sequence of meetings is bringing a common understanding to the basis and the reasons for working together. And I think it's all very positive. So I just want to say again, I appreciate the work of the staff in advance and the work of the commissioners in advance in preparing for this meeting and the upcoming discussion of how to improve Columbia River fish runs and fisheries. So thank you all for the meeting today.
Thank you, Commissioner. Oregon Commissioner Zarnowitz.
Yes, this is Jill Zarnowitz, excuse me, and I represent District 1 of Congressional District 1 in Oregon, and it's to the west of Greg Woolley's, Commissioner Woolley's district.
Thank you. Washington Director, will you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Chair Wall. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kelly Susan, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Director. Looking forward to a really full agenda today.
Thank you. Our Oregon Director.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Kurt Melcher. I'm the Director of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and happy to be here this morning. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks especially to Michelle Tate and Nikki Clofer for their preparation for this meeting. Are there operational or logistic things you need to tell us before we start?
Not that I'm aware of, Chair Wall. I think we're good to go.
Thank you. Then let's go ahead and start. This is, as several people have noted, an important issue to be able to focus on the Columbia River resource and increasing the runs. We have pivoted away for now from the usual allocation and gear types discussions to talk first about conservation of the resource. And so we'll start with a status of the wild runs update from Bill Twite from the Washington side and Chris Curran from the Oregon side. So will the two of you go ahead?
Sure. Can you hear me? This
Yes.
is Chris.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, my camera was a little slow there. Good morning. Give me just a second, please, to get the PowerPoint together and ready to go.
Chair Wall, did you want me to pull up the agenda really quick?
If you have a minute to just flash it between as Chair Carpenter suggested, that would be terrific.
Yeah.
Until Chris is ready to go, that would be great.
I'm getting a message that I can't share while somebody else is sharing.
We'll take it off.
Go ahead, Chris.
There
much
we
bad
go.
idea.
Okay, there. Now we got it. Hang on just a second.
There we go.
Okay, and hopefully it'll go to slideshow shortly. How's that?
Yes, we can see it, and you have the icons around the side as well, if you want those.
It's not in slideshow mode yet.
Oh, it's not.
Mm-mm.
That's interesting. Oh, darn it.
Hey, Chris, if you go off of shared screen and then go into slideshow and then come back in, it'll work.
Okay. All right.
Chris, this is Bill. We still have the work screen, not the slideshow.
How about now?
Nope.
Oh, man. All right.
I'm seeing if I can pull it up.
Yeah, it's because I'm using presentation mode. I can, let me turn that off and it'll
Yeah.
maybe.
And you still, even if you can't get full screen with your slide, you could still click through the list of your slides going down and they'll still pop up. So you should still pop up. So that, if it comes down to that, it's okay.
Let me know if this is still showing notes or the slides on the side.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot. All right.
This means that we know what's coming up. That's all.
Yeah.
You're set now.
Oh, there we go.
I got you. You're good. Go ahead.
Oh, it worked?
Okay. Just tell me to go to the next slide.
Oh, so you've got it. Okay, so you've got it on your end?
Yeah, I've got the PDF up.
Oh, okay. That'll work. Okay. Sorry for the delay there. Yeah, good morning. Chris Kern from Oregon Fish and Wildlife. Bill Twite from Washington is also going to participate in this. And just for a little quick background, the last staff at the last meeting, there were some run size updates that were sort of aggregate run size with hatchery and wild combined. And there was a discussion and request to do something more focused on just the wild stock. So we've refined that and added some more material to capture that today, or at least attempt to do so. I will say, there are a lot of, as you all know, a lot of individual runs. So while we're trying to get to a pretty fine scale, it's not as fine as can be done. It's just in the interest of time, we've got, a level of detail that we thought would fit. So go to the next slide, please. Okay. Just to kind of orient you to how we've organized this, there's probably many ways you could do it. You could do it by species or other mechanisms. We're using sort of our calendar basis, which is approximately aligned with the management structures as well. So this figure is simply to demonstrate we've got salmonids and other species in the river all year. There's a seasonality to it, which you're all well aware of. We're approximately organizing this relatively seasonally. So just to kind of keep you on track with how we've laid this out, what you can expect coming in the next, as we move through. So next slide, please, Nikki. Okay, and again, this is just an orientation sort of slide to kind of give you a sense of where we're heading. So we've got the spring period, and within that we've got a few of the runs of particular significance. Again, all wild fish discussion. So we'll go through Willamette and then the upriver stocks. Summer season, again, we'll have upper Columbia summers. We've got Snake River wild sockeye, and the start of the A and B index steelhead runs, which do carry into the next bullet, which is fall. And then when we get to the fall period, we've got lower Columbia wild and several fall Chinook stocks to go through. We're going to rotate through between Bill and I and kind of trade off just to break things up a bit. So, and then next slide, Nikki. We'll also hit a bit on a couple other species. White sturgeon was on the list, and we've added a quick bullet on Yulicon and Pacific lamprey as well. Not a lot of detail, but some. And then, okay, there you go. Thank you. And that's just a title slide, so you can keep going. Okay, thanks. So the first slide here is wild spring Chinook in the Willamette. And don't pay much attention to that thing in the upper corner. I'll tell you what that's about in a sec. First thing, just orient you to a little bit to how we've structured the color patterns. The Oregon commissioners will be familiar with this. It's the same slide format I have been using. So the colored slides are the annual run sizes, and the orange where we have it will represent a forecast. So again, this is Willamette spring Chinook. They're listed under the ESA as threatened. We've got a time series here in the main graph going from 2003 onward. The reason for that is that's the first full year return of hatchery fish that were 100% adipose fin clipped. So that's where we get really good ability to distinguish between natural and hatchery fish. Also, and this gets to the reason why I've got the inset in the upper corner, the first few years of this time series happen to be two of the largest total overall returns to the Willamette on record in terms of just total number. And so I wanted to put a little bit of context on that, and that's the upper right figure. Again, it's very small. It's not something that I intended you to see detail on, but that little boxed area is the time series in the main graph, just for reference. So you can see the total return in those first few years was over 100,000, well over 100,000, some of the biggest returns we've had. And then the other thing you can maybe take home from this smaller figure is, it goes back to 1946, is just the thing we've talked about fairly often, which is sort of the cyclic nature of some of these returns. So that's the point for that. No more detail than that was intended. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is Snake River Wilds. And this one's at the Columbia River mouth. This is a stock that's listed as threatened. It's an aggregate of many stocks, or many populations, I guess I should say. And so this is the aggregate return estimated back to the river mouth. You'll see some similar figure or a similar figure from Tucker later that's more in the upriver areas, I think at Lower Granite. This is a more abundant stock than what you'll see as the next stock coming, which would be Upper Columbia. In part because it's destined for it's also destined for a much larger area, and also I think more tributaries as well, but Bill can confirm that. But it is the bigger portion of the wild return in the spring period. And a few things to note, we see the downturn in, you can see a very low series of returns in the mid 90s. I think we've all talked about that. Over time, that's sort of a period of really poor survival, really poor returns. It coincided with a number of the listings in the basin. And we've seen a return to a downturn that's pretty poor in recent years as well. One thing of note, and there's been some recent work put out from the Nez Perce tribe on this particular run and the populations within it. While we're seeing have seen poor survival in recent years, there are still more fish showing in this number, and at least part of the reason for that is there have been some programs implemented since the mid 90s to boost this stock, one of which is a reintroduction in the Clearwater system in Idaho, which was fully extirpated, so contributed 0 fish back in the 90s, and is contributing more than 0 now. So that bumps up that total average compared to the remainder of those populations. And then also there's been integrated enhancement conservation hatchery programs in some cases to preserve the genetics, well, in many cases to preserve the genetics of some of these populations in the snake. And those are counted here as natural returning fish, even if they are progeny from originally from hatchery fish. So you'll see though, the status of some of these Snake River individual populations is believed to be currently pretty much very similar to as bad as it was in the 90s. So not great. And again, Tucker will probably speak a little bit about some of that. Those bear on the SAR discussions as well. So I believe, Nikki, the next slide goes to Upper Columbia, and I'm going to turn it over to Bill for the next couple of slides, I believe.
Good morning, commissioners. This is Bill Twite with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Thanks, Chris. So this is the Upper Columbia Wild Spring Chinook, run sizes to the Columbia River mouth. As Chris mentioned, it's a much smaller population than the Snake River population. And he's correct, it's many fewer tributaries. The wild fish primarily use 2 tributaries in Washington, the Methow and the Wenatchee. Prior to Grand Coulee Dam, they were able to access a lot more of the watershed up into Canada. And we're certain it was a much larger run back then. Chris has pointed out the cyclical nature of the returns. That shows up really well in these slides also. And for Washington in the mid-90s, those were really grim years. We were very worried about localized extinctions. At the time, we began several captive brood programs in order to preserve the genetic structure of the small amount of remaining wild fish up there. And you can see that in the good years in the ocean, they are doing reasonably well. We're still nowhere near any of the goals that you'll be hearing about later on with these fish, but we definitely have recovered beyond the 90s. And we appear to be staying above those levels, even in this most recent downturn. We are planning on taking a much closer look, a much more fine-grained look at the individual population returns over the next year or so. It'll be fairly similar to the analysis that I believe Tucker will be later on in the presentation. And so we will be able to take a more fine-grained look. This is about as detailed as we can get.
Bill?
Yes.
It's Mary Wall. I have a quick question on this one. When the numbers are returns for the Columbia River mouth, is there any kind of rule of thumb about how many of those, say 2,000 that are expected at the mouth will get to the area where they would spawn?
Yeah, we can. In fact, we do forecast that as part of the harvest planning. And we have factors for, in addition to the harvest rates that we'll be managing to stay beneath in both the treaty and the non-treaty. We also have factors for what we expect to see in terms of just natural loss as they move upstream, essentially passage mortality. And so we are able to forecast with fairly decent accuracy what we'll be seeing, both as they pass through their last main stem dam, which for the Wenatchee fish is Rock Island Dam, and we get good counts of them there. So we're able to sort of confirm as they move up river whether our forecasts were of spawning escapement were correct. The only thing we really can't forecast then is how effectively they'll spawn, whether or not we'll have warm water temperatures that increase the natural mortality prior to spawning.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Upper Columbia Summer Chinook. which are not listed. The springs are listed as endangered. You can see it's very low numbers. The summers are a very different type of fish. So, and Nikki, if you'll, oh, sorry, I'm not, I made the mistake of, there we go. The summer Chinook are a ocean type Chinook rather than a stream type Chinook. The spring Chinook that Chris has been discussing spend a full year in freshwater as juveniles prior to going out. The summer Chinook, which are one of the several ocean types that we'll be talking about, many of them go out as juveniles in their first year after incubation and emergence. And so they show a much greater amount of wider amount of adaptations in terms of their life history. And that may be part of the reason that that they're doing much better. The graph here is showing just escapements. We have not completed an actual run reconstruction to the river mouth or out into the ocean for the wild fish alone. We can show you that for the combined wild and hatchery, but not for the wild fish. So, but this gives you a good picture of how they're faring nonetheless. At present, we're managing for an interim escapement goal. We're still trying to determine what an appropriate escapement goal would be of around 13,000 is my memory. As you can see, we dip below that sometimes, but we're above it at other much of the time. The reason this starts in 2002 is that we really did not have much in the way of stock assessment prior to 2000, and it took us a little while to pull it together. The status of these fish prior to 2000 was poor, and we believe that's a combination of factors. One, many of these fish are migrating through 9 dams, some of them just through 8, and in fact, the Okanagan portion, which is often the most abundant portion, are migrating through 9 dams. And so considerable passage loss, particularly before we instituted spill regimes at the mid-Columbia dams, along with improved spill and passage through the 4 lower main stem dams. So we believe we've dramatically improved juvenile survival moving downstream, primarily through the combined efforts of the agencies, the fish management agencies, through the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission process in the 1990s. So when the ocean conditions turned around in 2000, what had been very low unharvestable numbers, and often really even not easily assessed, their numbers essentially increased almost tenfold within the space of a couple of years. You see the difference between the very poor ocean years of the 90s and the much better ocean years we've seen since then. Even with these recent downturns, they have not dropped as low. So this is a population that we're continuing to put a lot of resources into assessing, and we're trying to continue to refine our management framework, but the current management framework does appear to be sustaining the runs far better than the hydro management, as well as the primarily the hydro management framework that we'd been using prior to 2000.
Bill?
Prior
to 2000, there was essentially no harvest on these fish. Yes?
This is Nikki. It looks like Chair Carpenter and Commissioner McIsaac have a question.
Okay.
Larry, do you want to go?
Yeah, I got to remember to unmute myself again. Bill, thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, are these fish then migrating as zeros? Is that, first of all, that's part of the question. The other part is, because they're going a year earlier than say the spring salmon do they have additional environmental risk, at the mouth of the river because of bird predation, sea lion predation, etc.? And how potentially are they more at risk because of future El Ninos going into the ocean directly offshore of the Columbia Bar?
A large portion of them outmigrate as zeros. Some portion of them do outmigrate as 1-year-olds. So some of them rear either in rivers or the reservoirs until they're a full year old before outmigrating. And we run our integrated hatchery programs that we've used to help conserve these populations and bolster them. We run similarly where we have both yearling and sub-yearling release strategies. I can't really answer the question about predation. We simply don't have enough information. These are far north migrating fish. These summer Chinook, meaning that many of them go as far north as the Gulf of Alaska. And so while we see a little bit of an El Nino impact in the marine survivals, we don't see as much. We're not sure though about these new thermal events because those reach all the way into the Gulf of Alaska, like the blob, where gigantic portions of the Northeast Pacific are subject to significantly higher than normal temperatures. We don't know yet how they appear to be impacting them though, because they're showing the same drop off that many of the other Chinook stocks were showing apparently in response to the blob conditions.
Well, thank you for that. I think continuing prudent oversight of those trends regarding water temperature, El Ninos, et cetera, I think is obviously very important, Bill. Thank you.
Commissioner McIsaac, your question?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And Bill, thanks for a nice presentation on the summer Chinook. I'll have a question about what might have happened to the left side of your graph. It is good to hear you say that with the improvements in the interdam survival, that there was a tremendous response. You said tenfold in the survival of summer Chinook. Wow, that's a real positive success story. But in terms of you saying prior to 2000, things were unharvestable. I recall from our graph last time that went back to the early 70s, I think, that there were run sizes of hatchery and wild at the river mouth that were chronically in the 20,000 fish range, maybe some less. So if you were to imagine extrapolating this out into a long time trend back to the 70s, would we expect to see that if there was total run sizes of 20,000, that what was showing up as the escapement in these areas that you've got shown here would be very, very small? I mean, your two smallest runs here are just around 5,000 or a little bit more. That back in those days, before the interdam improvements and such, and building escapements begets building escapements if you've got capacity there, that those numbers to the left of the screen would be very, very small. Would that be something that we should have as a takeaway?
Yes. And unless there's any further questions, I believe I'm turning it back to Chris. I will mention that this presentation does not include the wild sockeye returns to the Wenatchee and the Okanagan. That was on me to get done, and I didn't get it done before I was headed into some time off. But I'll just quickly state that neither of those populations are listed, and both are reasonably healthy. They don't always offer harvest, particularly the Wenatchee, but we're typically able to maintain escapement. The Okanagan in particular has shown some pretty strong population increases and has been able to sustain reasonably strong harvest levels, particularly in the sport fishery in the Upper Columbia and in the Colville tribal fishery in the Okanagan River, as well as to the First Nations on the Canadian side of the border. And part of that is because we're continuing to improve the habitat, which is mostly on the north side of the border, as well as open up additional rearing lakes. So real success story there. Apologize for not having any graphics. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah. So yeah, and I'll touch on a little bit of that. So this figure is just the Snake River wild sockeye. So this is commonly referred to as the Redfish Lake sockeye, destined for the Stanley Basin in Idaho. There's actually two pieces of data represented here. Well, actually, let me back up. So this is an endangered population. It's one of the most dramatic cases of the listing and decline of some of the salmon. This is the run of fish that Lonesome Larry came from, where we had a single fish come back in a single year. Triggered a massive conservation effort to put a number of fish into a propagation situation to save the genetics, as well as I think some cryopreservation techniques and a whole number of other very significant efforts. So what's showing here are actually two pieces. There's the bars are the calculated estimated return to the river mouth of the stock, and then the red line is the actual measured return reported for the Stanley Basin itself. So we don't have a number for 2020 for that. So you may, I don't even know if it's big enough that you can see it, but you may be able to see an NA on there. And I'm not aware of a forecast for 21, but the real point was just to show the trends. Very, very poor numbers. And again, single digits in the mid 90s. And then an increase, thankfully, due to a lot of these measures taken, including not my expertise, but including bringing fish from hatchery, conservation hatchery programs, putting them back in the lake to spawn naturally, and some ongoing conservation hatchery programs as well to keep that run alive. And then, Tucker and Bill touched on it. Tucker will talk about it some. While we've got some issues with the hydro system still remaining, there have been some improvements that have probably benefited as well. So that's, and as Bill mentioned, I guess the one last point, this run comes back at a time where we can have some of those other sockeye populations from the upper Columbia areas that are highly abundant with this stock mixed in. So Bill made that point as well. So go ahead, Nikki, to the next slide. Okay, so this is we're getting to steelhead now. So this is the wild A index steelhead return measured at Bonneville Dam. These actually, as I mentioned earlier, these do occur through summer and fall, but we'll go ahead and do them now. This ESU is a threatened ESU. And the first component of the summer steelhead wild return is this A index. These are the fish that generally spend a year at sea. So they return at a smaller size than most of the B index fish. We've got populations of these, this stock in both the upper Columbia and Snake Rivers. And again, you can see the cycles that we've talked about before. You've got the downturn in the mid 90s, and then very recently, not a secret, and something the commissions are both very familiar with. We've talked about it a fair bit over the last few years. In recent years, down a bit too. Next slide, Nikki, should be B index. A little more. There we go. Thank you. Again, I'll point out, if you'll notice this, so this is the B index portion of the run for the wild run, and note the smaller scale on the y-axis. This is a smaller stock, and even when it's relatively abundant, it's a smaller stock than the A index. This is also a threatened DSU. These are the steelhead that generally stay at sea for 2 years before returning home, and therefore they're usually larger than the A index fish. There's obviously, maybe not obviously, there is overlap in size between the stocks, but it's a general pattern that holds true. Their run timing is a little later than the A index, and they, in terms of when they start to come back, and they hang on a little longer through some of the lower areas in terms of before they complete their return. And essentially all the B index populations are in the Idaho portions of the Snake River and Clearwater areas. Again, you've got the cycles over time and the same downturn back in the 90s. And then of course, what we've seen in the last few years is a few, in particular, a few years of very low numbers, punctuated by some a little better, but still overall very poor. And as you're familiar with, those have triggered some unprecedented measures in our fishery management to increase the protections for these fish in particular. And I think the next slide will head back to fall Chinook, and that means I'm turning it back over to Bill, I believe.
Thanks, Chris. A couple of different slides on here. And of course, it's really small on my screen. And hang on, let me pull my glasses out here. Pardon me. First off, the Tule spawning escapement slide. Actually, I'll start in the lower left with the Tule spawning escapement slide. That's one component of the slide in the upper right, the lower river wildfall Chinook. And the Tules are one of the listed components, and so these govern harvest. Because the Tules don't distribute as far north as the Brights do, much of the harvest of the Tules occurs within U.S. waters or southern Canadian waters. And so these are a real subject of annual management concern, both in the Pacific Salmon Commission process as well as in the Pacific Fishery Management Council process. And then finally in river, where the states and the tribes are the primary managers of the fisheries. And as you can see, the Thule escapements have been, other than showing the one strong marine survival spike in the early 2000s, they've been moderately stable. They haven't shown some of the major cyclical variation that a lot of those spring Chinook and even the summer Chinook slides showed. And this is probably, again, because we're showing escapement. We use harvest to dampen the effects of those large swings in marine productivity by decreasing harvest rates fairly substantially in years when marine survival is down, and then increasing in other years. The upper right, the lower river wildfall Chinook, is composed primarily of tributaries in Washington. And as I mentioned already, this is the bright stock, the far north migrating stock. As a result, some of the differences you're seeing are just the differences in where they go in the ocean and how that affects their marine survival.
Bill?
Yes.
Before you leave that one, a quick question. Can you relate these two to each other again? If the bottom left is escapement and it's about 20,000 forecast, and the upper one is rivermouth return and it's about 20,000 forecast, what's the relationship?
Actually, I believe I misspoke briefly when I said that the Thule is incorporated in the upper one, and
Okay.
So thank you for offering me the chance to correct that. There are two separate populations, the Thules being the more southern population that come in darker in coloration, which is the source of the name Thule, and then the lower river wilds are actually the Brights, and those are the further north. And apologize for not having them both in the same scale, in terms of one being rivermouth run size and the other being escapement. But we chose these because they're sort of our best measure to show you. What we're focusing on here is trying to kind of show the general health currently, as well as some of the history of these wild stocks. And these two graphs were our best way of showing the history for each.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, the presentation itself was very helpful. I just didn't get that connection. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I misspoke, so I appreciate you catching that. Thank you.
Bill?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. This is Jim Anderson. I guess I'm struck by the significant difference in the two charts, in that the lower river tules, as you mentioned, are been subject to a lot of more local U.S. management through PFMC and in-river, USV Oregon, USV Washington discussions. And as compared to the upper chart, which is obviously more cyclical and appears to be more or less under control, if you will. And I guess that says to me that we have less influence in those forums, or we have patterns and management constraints that affect what we can do in those scenarios, as compared to what we can and have done with the lower river toolings. Is that a good way to look at that?
I would agree with part of it, but not all of it.
Okay.
Yes, these show greater marine survival, and yes, when you're managing the far north, you're also dealing with the northern British Columbia and Alaskan fisheries, as well as the southern BC and just the lower 48 fisheries for the tules. So yes, that there are more factors, but I would say that this graph shows very well, really, that we are capable of taking advantage of the good years, and we're also capable of minimizing the effect of the downturns in the lower marine survival years. You only see a couple of years on there that are really sort of concerningly low. There's a lot of years on there that cluster somewhat near the mean, which means to me that we are using harvest appropriately to sort of buffer those, because again, while these don't show the effects of the in-river harvest, they do show the effects of our management of the harvests in the ocean, both international as well as domestic. And the fact that we've only got a couple of years in there that where the numbers are really well below 10,000, I think shows that so far we're able to maintain pretty stable production in spite of all of those, in spite of the greater number of variables.
Okay.
This is Chris. Could I add a quick add-on to that?
Please.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that strikes me as we think about that is there is, Bill discussed the intensity of management for tules, but there are management objectives and constraints on harvest objectives for the lower river wild stock as well. They're just different. And it is also often the case that in our efforts to manage for the health of something like the Tule population or the upriver bright population, the Snake River Wildfall Chinook population, we also create a harvest protection for that stock along at the same time. And so with co-occurring fisheries and weak stock management, you end up doing some of that as well. So whether it's a directly driving, so to speak, a fishery choice or series of choices in a year may not always be detectable from this, but those other factors play in. It gets complicated, but hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you. Commissioner McIsaac, you had a question as well?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And with regard to the graph on the upper right, what strikes me there is some long-term stability. Now, this is a group of fish that does not have to go through any dams on the main stem. This is all below Bonneville Dam, and they're subject, of course, to wide swings in ocean productivity. And as you've indicated, there's also an ocean fishery factor on these. But all in all, through this long time frame, you see what you've mentioned as a cyclical nature, going from some pretty low things to some pretty high things. But all in all, it strikes me as this is a good example of kind of a stable population that shows what kind of swings you can get if the ocean is sour or the ocean is bountiful, whether you got a drought in freshwater or you have excellent freshwater conditions. And sometimes you can get the double whammy of a drought and a bad ocean at the same time. So I guess my takeaway here is knowing what the cyclical nature of these populations is capable of. And I don't know if that's a question or not, but if that's the wrong takeaway, maybe that's a question for me. Am I looking at this in the right way?
So that's a setup. Commissioner McIsaac is his professional cut his professional teeth on these fish. I believe starting in the later 60s, or was it early 70s?
1920s. No.
Some of the oldest photos we have are Commissioner McIsaac pulling on a beach seine in the Lewis River, seining up juveniles, I believe, for tagging. Some of the earliest tagging programs on wild fish. So you are correct. And in fact, what I ask commissioners to do is try to keep this graph a little bit in mind, or this figure a little bit in mind when we go on and show the Hanford Reach, which are another bright population that are much larger, but spawn about 4 dams. And with that, unless there's further questions.
There is one question from Commissioner Zarnowitz.
Okay.
Yeah, having monitored water conditions in inland water conditions over the years as a farmer, basically, I see some other patterns similar to Commissioner McIsaac mentioned, in that in the 1980s was a fairly wet period. And even though it was fairly wet towards the later 1980s, obviously the ocean conditions were pretty significant in that. And I've seen this in all these graphs, not just the one that we're looking at. There's quite a pattern that follows. And then as the freshwater conditions, we get a La Nina type situation come through. Then if the ocean conditions are good, then we get a lot of good escapement of juveniles. For instance, while we had pretty severe El Niños in the mid-teen 2000s, 2014, 2015, 16, and on, we had actually some pretty good returns, as you can see in these particular things. They popped up, but not just in this species, but in the others, because there was the 2010 and 2011, and even to some extent 2012, cooler conditions on land and more water. And so we got more fish going out to sea than if the ocean conditions were negative, then those fish took a hit. But I continue to see this pattern in these, and I'm sure, harvest and dams and all that figure in to some of those numbers as well. But there's definitely some correlation between the returns that are coming back several years later after the wet conditions, unless the ocean conditions really crash them. So it's interesting to be looking at all these different species that have pretty similar patterns, regardless of what level the species is at.
And fishery scientists have pointed out that at least with the El Nino La Nina cycle, the ENSO cycle, that there is a strong sort of teleconnection between ocean conditions and conditions in the freshwater habitat too. So, which is sort of both good and bad when it can, because they're sort of positively connected, when conditions are tough in the ocean, they're also tough in freshwater environments. And so it can be especially hard on fish. When they're good in the ocean, it can also be good in freshwater environments. And so again, it's the role of harvest to try to buffer that in a way that produces some more stability in the runs than we would see if harvest simply always took the same share every single year. And so that's one of the principles of abundance-based management, is to try to do that. What concerns me is that we don't know if the same thing is true with these gigantic marine heat waves that we're starting to see. We don't know if there's a similar sort of connection between freshwater survivals and productivity in the freshwater environment and productivity in the marine environment when these heat waves are raging. They're simply too new for us to really understand well, in the same way that we now understand the El Nino La Nina cycle. Are we ready to move on to the next slide?
Yes, no more questions. Thank you.
All right. Still in fall Chinook here, but a different set of populations. I was referring to the upriver bright spawning escapement. Again, bright fish, far north migrants. So similar in terms of marine life history to those lower river wilds, the brights that several of you asked about that were in the upper right. Now sort of contrast that with the lower left, and you can see the definite effects of cyclical marine survival showing up in that lower left in those banner years that we saw just prior to the appearance of the blob, but following some of the El Ninos that Commissioner Zarnowitz referred to. And this is a population that I only somewhat tongue-in-cheek refer to now as the healthiest natural population of fall Chinook anywhere in the eastern North Pacific. And it's not entirely tongue-in-cheek, as we've seen dramatic declines in survival of wild Chinook, really from the Sacramento River to the Yukon River. There aren't too many natural returns that are left that are of the magnitude that we saw in just, in that most recent surge of now almost 5 years ago, when we had those 3 just phenomenal returns. But even at these somewhat more moderate numbers, as you look at the vertical axis on that, you can see that they sort of cycle around between 50 and 100,000. And that's pretty impressive currently for many fall Chinook runs, really, again, anywhere in the eastern North Pacific, which is more indicative, I think, of the general malaise of Chinook in the eastern North Pacific. But it's also a testament to the management regimes that have really worked well for these fish. In the 1970s, we began to understand the importance of how flows are timed through the Hanford Reach. The Hanford Reach is the one free-flowing stretch of the Columbia upstream of the McNary Pool and below Priest Rapids Dam. Much of it now flowing through Hanford Reach National Monument. And as we began to understand the effects of power operations in particular, and the way that the river was operated with tremendous fluctuations on a daily basis, we realized that many of the fall Chinook reds in this stretch were being subjected to desiccation daily, or sometimes even several days at a time, and we were losing a lot of productivity. And so some of our earliest work in the main stem was actually centered around stabilizing flows during the incubation and early emergence period for these fish. And believe the first agreement was in around 1976 governing that. And you can see that we got results fairly quickly as soon as the next series of good wet years that, again, Commissioner Zarnowitz referred to, that were years of increased productivity for these fish, both in the freshwater and the ocean environment. We got a good surge that carried them well through those tough years in the 90s. Got another excellent surge when conditions turned around in 2000. So you can really see the effects of the linked marine and freshwater environment survivals there. And then that stunning surge most recently is probably due to as well, many of the changes that we've made to how juvenile passage is managed through the hydro system. I think that really started showing up in the most recent years as well. But so between managing then harvest through the Salmon Treaty and through the Council from Alaska waters into the lower 48, but more importantly through habitat management work that's now coming on to almost half a century of effectiveness, and hydro management with downstream passage survival for these fish, which primarily go out as fingerlings. You can see that this is a very healthy stock. Was never really considered even for listing. The portion of the bright population that has been listed is shown in the upper right, and that's the Snake River Wildfall Chinook. Again, they are brights as well, but they're distinct from the Columbia fish in that there's a fair amount of the snake that where they no longer spawn, and so we've managed them entirely separately. They're listed, they are ESA listed. You can see there the effects of several different things. We, even prior to the listing, but accelerated post-listing, we began using enhancement to supplement the natural population. So genetic conservation and the entire program was directed at improving natural escapements. You can see the effects of that taking effect sort of slowly and then through the downturn a little bit. But once we were past that downturn in the later 2000s, pretty significant effects. And now the natural populations definitely sustaining themselves at a higher level, even through, again, some of the most recent dips. So this is this population has reached several of its delisting goals, not quite all of them, but it is it's a population that definitely shows the effects of both hydro system management. Much of the hydro system summer management is keyed specifically to improving the downstream passage of these Snake River Fall fish. The Hanford Reach fish benefit incidentally from that, as well as the very targeted use of artificial enhancement as a supplementation tool. So happy to take questions on these, and if there aren't any,
Bill, there is one question from.
Turn it back to Chris.
Bill, there is a question from Commissioner Woolley, and
Okay.
then we're getting close on our time, so we'll have to keep going. But Commissioner Woolley.
Well, I think you answered my question toward the end of your talk. I was going to ask you to elaborate more on the juvenile passage improvement, sort of the methodology around that led to the downstream passage survival. And it sounds like it's primarily the hydro system management and the targeted use of harvest. What about habitat improvement? Was that also a factor in the upswing?
Some, but primarily hydro. And again, summer spill has been the predominant tool there for improving hydro system passage. These fish are primarily main stem spawners. There has been some work to make sure that they have access to some of the bigger tributaries, but it's primarily it's primarily been reducing passage mortality and then using supplementation techniques to kind of break out of the demographic slump that you can see there, in that series of years that are just barely above zero.
Okay, thanks, Bill.
Bill, we don't have time for this question now, but I'll be looking for an answer later on or afterwards. But it sounds like we've had success in some of these management changes, the hydro changes and the spills and some of these other pieces. And one of the things you said that seemed important was also what we know may not be true also with these giant new heat waves. So my question, and again, we can answer it later, is that we're having this success with some of these and improving them enough to meet some of the ESA goals. And that takes care of the problems that we were experiencing. Does it also address the problems that are coming at us with climate change? So don't need to answer it now, just in the interest of time, but I'd like to come back to that one.
I think you may hear some answers to that both in the presentations on I know the partnership and the collaborative are wrestling with those, particularly I think the collaborative will wrestle with those. And I think some of the monitoring tools that Tucker will be talking about also will help us understand that better.
Thank you. Let's go ahead.
Okay, so this is Chris. I'm back for this one for the next couple. So this slide is similar to one I think I showed the Oregon Commission, and it's reflecting the Lower Columbia wild coho population spawning escapement. Now this is a sum of several populations. I think it's at least, what, Bill, 10 in Washington, maybe 13, and 4 distinct ones in Oregon as well. So this is the aggregate of all of them. This is a threatened issue, as with so many other things you can see in the 90s, the downturn that we've seen so often, maybe another small one in the 2012 sort of area, and then a gradual building. That building actually kind of matches what we're seeing on the Oregon coast natural coho population, incidentally. And I think one of the keys for this one is that I would point out is that even though we've seen the poor survival in the ocean for so many stocks over the last several years, this population has actually held on, and at least as an aggregate, and built back up a bit during that time. So it's still got a long ways to go. It's not, I don't believe, anywhere near its delisting criteria, but certainly a good sign that we've managed to get through a downturn with some positive response. I mentioned in the Oregon meeting the return last year to the Clackamas River of wild fish was actually the largest I can find on record, going back into the 1950s. So that's a positive response. I think go to the next slide, which should just be a title slide, Nikki. Thank you. So you can keep going. Okay. And we'll, in the interest of time, I'll try and be fairly brief, I guess. I think the commissions have both seen this material fairly recently. So this is the Lower Columbia stock assessment results for abundance of fish, just in the legal size, the harvest legal size slot, 38 to 54 inches. This is with the current methodology of population assessment. We do have data going further back. What we're showing here is a building population since the downturn we saw several years ago. It is still probably not, well, it is not as high as it has been in the past. So we've still got some issues. In particular, we've been, I think, as both commissions are aware, observing pretty poor recruitment to the population at the juvenile size classes. And so, you know, the projections for legal abundance and down the road will be affected by that. There'll be less overall legal fish down the road than there would have been otherwise. There's a couple points of interest there. We've got the projections from our population modeling efforts, which have actually been pretty close to the estimated abundance over time, and that's an improvement. So that's a significant improvement in our management. Go to the next slide, please. And this just shows similar trends in adult abundance. We've got the status levels you see here are derived from the Oregon Conservation Plan. And again, you've seen this, I believe. The take-home message here is we had a dip in adult population size several years ago, and it's rebuilding fairly well. And so again, that's a good thing. I think, you know, as we look at recruitment as an issue, one of the things that we can do to help that situation is to build the adult population size so that when the conditions are favorable, there's a good number of spawners there to take advantage of that and provide recruitment. I'll mention briefly, I meant to do it on the other slide, but and Tucker will send me a note if I don't. But sturgeon are a periodic, they're well adapted to a periodic recruitment strategy. It's kind of what they're built to do. So while we are concerned about recruitment, when it's long periods with little recruitment, the fact is they can make up for that fairly quickly when conditions become more favorable, just based on their life history. So,
Chris, one quick,
go ahead, next slide. Sure.
Chris, a quick question on this desired status. Is this in the lower river or overall? Does it include the various pools?
Oh, I apologize. I meant to fix that label and I didn't. This is still the lower river.
Got it.
Yeah, so this is still the Bonneville population. Yeah, thank you for the question. Go ahead, Nikki. We will now move to another unlabeled slide, which should say Zone 6. So this is the population above Bonneville. So the three pools, Bonneville, the Dalles, John Day, and the points here, we've been doing stock assessments in these populations and various population dynamics work since 1986, but have been doing regular assessments since about 1999. And currently these are all get a population assessment done every 3 years. So you'll see the data points are 3 years apart for each population. So basically it's a rotation. The crews are out working in these reservoirs every year, they just rotate. And these generally reflect what we see in the recruitment in these populations, in that the John Day population is lower and very frankly infrequent reproduction measured. The Dalles a bit more common, but not every year. And for a long time, we saw Bonneville would have some measurable recruitment almost every year. I'm not sure that still holds. And there's of course some things like the habitat available in the pools, the size of the pools, and some other factors bear on the population size as well. But these do happen to kind of match the patterns we see in reproduction. So the other thing we get from this assessment that's really important is the size structure and growth rates. And these studies have really provided a ton of population dynamics data. I would say one of the most robust mark recapture type data sets on the West Coast for any species. And this is work that we do cooperatively between the two states and the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. So with that, I think Bill is going to talk to some of the upper areas upstream of Zone 6 and maybe through the rest of, I think he's got the rest of the presentation actually.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. So again, sort of going back to Commissioner Wall's question, we wish we were able to be talking about total sturgeon abundance, but because of the effects of the hydro system completely blocking adult movement and only really allowing juvenile movement in one direction, and that's downstream, what was formerly a single large population with access throughout to the ocean environment is now changed into a series of individual populations that we have to assess individually because they are the only way they're connected at all is just through the one vector of downstream juvenile migration. And I think not coincidentally, as you move further upstream, further away from the ocean, you see smaller and smaller populations and more population trajectories that aren't as positive as the ones that we were showing you from lower down. And so you can see here that our work in the Lower Snake and the McNary Pool are generally showing population declines, with the potential exception of the McNary Pool. These are areas where we've either completely closed harvest or we really dramatically reduced harvest impacts on these fish. But you're also looking at much smaller abundance ranges as well, as you can see, versus the much larger numbers from downstream. And then there's, next slide, please. The Hanford Reach, even though the habitat is good because it is the free-flowing stretch, because we've had very few resources for consistent monitoring, and so what we do know is based on inconsistent and relatively sparse monitoring. So this is a population that is still, we have concerns about. We don't find, we find that the fish that are there are growing very slowly and that we are not seeing a lot of recruitment. So this is an area where we're continuing to move towards more and more conservative management relative to harvest impacts. Another area that we could have potentially shown you is the sturgeon above Grand Coulee. Also another area where we have long-term concerns. We have been able to do some monitoring of those, and the only time we've been allowing harvest at all in recent years is as a tool to help us manage the enhancement program that is going on up in Lake Roosevelt, where we're using where we've got an enhancement project that we want to ensure that the enhanced fish don't end up overwhelming the remaining natural fish. And so we use harvest removals as a tool to help manage that. But otherwise, harvest in these areas is at this point essentially non-existent. And that's in part because of what we do know gives us some concerns, as well as we just at this point have a management approach to white sturgeon where if we're not able to provide some consistent monitoring information, our basic management approach is to remove harvest then if we don't have the data to support it. So with that, move on to Yulicon. This is, we thought that because the emphasis in this presentation was on wild salmon and sturgeon, we thought the commissions might be interested in two other important native fish that are almost entirely natural reproduction in the basin, and a quick view of the little bit that we know about status of those two as well. So first I'll cover Yulicon. We've only recently begun to be able to try to estimate total run size through back calculations from larval sampling, as well as from indications of abundance and biomass from test fisheries, and then adding in when we allow any recreational harvest as well, adding that into the biomass. And so you can see the some of the cyclical nature as well. They mirrored the Yulicon abundance appeared to mirror that spike we saw, particularly in the fall Chinook production in the 2013 through 15 time period. Dropping down, we apparently suffered a real low in 2018 and then some bounce back. Our understanding of Yulicon populations in the Columbia is that they've always showed very large variability, even prior to the advent of the hydro system, which has dramatically changed spring flow conditions. And in fact, they were at times in the past, they've been documented to simply not occur for a year or more in the Columbia and go elsewhere. So while we don't have a great context for looking at this kind of variability, the fact that we do see this doesn't concern us highly. What would concern us is if we saw very long periods of depressed populations. And that was apparently the case when these were listed as threatened, was a fairly long period of continually depressed populations. But some of the spikes we're seeing in recent years give us a sense that the population dynamics are still at work. And that's important, I think, for understanding sturgeon survival as well. We think that Yulicon are probably a key food, at least for the sturgeon below Bonneville. Again, noting that the above Bonneville populations of sturgeon have been cut off from access to Yulicon. But these have probably always been a keystone species as a forage fish species in the Columbia Basin. And so our hope is to continue to be able to conduct this kind of population monitoring. And then finally, Pacific lamprey, where we know even less, although in cooperation, both ODFW, WDFW, the tribes, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are working to improve our knowledge of lamprey in the basin. So if you go to that final slide, the slide I chose to use here gives you a sense of how lamprey in the basin are doing relative to our knowledge of Pacific lamprey in many other areas. And you can see several things in this. First off, large areas where, including in the Columbia Basin, where they're presumed to be simply extirpated, and that's been experienced by lamprey populations really up and down the continental North American coast, that the upper watersheds for lamprey are no longer accessible, that they formerly used. And that in general, there's conservation concerns really for most of the populations. There's a handful that are listed as simply not ranked, where we don't have the information, and a very small number that show up as green, meaning that at this point they're thought to not be of conservation concern per se. But overall, the status of lamprey in the Columbia Basin is poor to imperiled. And that's mirrored by our counts at the dams, which have decreased dramatically over the last couple of decades, as well as tribes in particular have begun doing in-river work in many of the tributaries, and they're simply not finding lamprey where they used to. So very significant conservation concerns, no ESA listings yet. The work that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is doing with the tribal and state managers is both has conservation purposes in order to try to begin to understand them well enough to understand what we could do to improve their status. But equally, it's also an attempt to, instead of having these fish ESA listed and having virtually all the control on recovery be federally determined, have the states and tribes working in partnership with the federal government to make decisions about recovery actions. And so an attempt to try to control our destiny a little bit better. But in general, the status for Pacific lamprey in the Columbia Basin is poor. Harvest impacts, as you know, are very low. The tribes do maintain some amount of harvest for cultural reasons and ceremonial reasons, extremely important as a first food to the tribes in the basin. But they're managing it very carefully because of the current status. And I believe that is our last slide. So apologies for running a little long, but it's a complicated story that we wanted to make sure we told. But I think in some, the point that I'd like to make just as we close is that at least from our perspective as managers, the largest human effects on these populations are in the hydro and in the habitat arenas, and that harvest's role at this point is to ensure that the gains that we've made in recovery are preserved and in fact amplified, but that harvest is primarily works as a buffer on the variations that we see that are both natural and habitat and hydro caused. And with that, I'll turn it back to Chris for any closing comments from him.
Just a quick question on the lamprey regarding just the extirpation of so many of them. Are you saying that this is all primarily dams? Because I know in terms of the human consumption, as far as I know, it's not, I don't see it on the menu. I mean, it's primarily native consumption, but you're saying that that's relatively modest. So they're just really disproportionately impacted by dam, even more than, than our salmon and steelhead.
Correct. Blockages that blockages are the number one problem, and simply just loss of access to areas. There are undoubtedly other problems in terms of contaminated sediments, in terms of poor conditions for incubation. Remember, these are fish that spend a long period of time in the benthic habitat, in the sediments, and grow very slowly. But the number one, and the reason for all that dark red extirpated showing up in the furthest inland reaches, that's all various blockages to passage, many of which are dams. We're just now learning how to sort of reconfigure fish patterns to work as effectively for lamprey as they currently do for salmon and steelhead.
Okay, all right, thank you, Bill.
We also have a question from Vice Chair Baker.
Well, thank you, Chair Wall. Thanks so much to Bill and Chris for this presentation. And so my takeaway from it was that these runs are cyclical, they are struggling, and that what has sort of kept many of these runs alive over the last 20 or 30 years has been very aggressive management from our staff and probably a lot of other people as well. Sort of putting this in context about what we're here to discuss, this may or may not be a fair question for Chris and Bill, but I'd like to know your thoughts on what the commissions can do to support and assist in the management that you're doing. So I'm asking for your takeaway on what we are up to.
Chris, do you want to start or you want me to?
Well, I'm happy to add a little bit, but I actually think that that might be a question maybe you want to ask after every presentation, but certainly at the end, because I think there will be some efforts by the other folks to kind of roll up and potentially provide some of that context that might be helpful for you, Commissioner. If Bill wants to chime in now with that, that's fine. But I kind of think that's probably coming as a downstream here.
Thanks. I agree with Chris. I think the holistic answer probably is best afterwards, but there is one. I've been thinking about concurrence a lot recently, in part because we just, I think as everybody knows, had a near miss with what would have put us into a major non-concurrence position with legislation that the governor vetoed. And I shudder to think what we would have, the problems that we could have created with harvest if the two states had not, over the last, really over a half a century, really, where we have been primarily concurrent on the big issues. I shudder to think what harvest would have done to negatively impact recovery, to potentially in some cases be the final death knell in some of the poor years, like in the 90s, at least of local populations, where we took extreme efforts to recover those small populations that were really struggling. If harvest had not been managed responsibly in close partnership between the two states, I just shudder to think what the outcome would have been. So concurrence to me is one part of it, but I completely agree with Chris. There's, I think the rest of you've structured today to answer that question more broadly than just harvest managers can answer.
Thank you, Bill.
And I would like to thank both of you as well. We all probably have a ton of questions that we could ask. In the interest of time, I'll keep moving. And our next presentation is Columbia River Basin Partnership Goals. And Guy Norman is going to speak about this. I see that Commissioner McIsaac, you have your hand up. Is that something that can wait on your question, or are you dying to ask it right this minute?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not really a question. Let me just say again, thanks to the staff for an excellent presentation. Last time we saw the aggregate hatchery and wild runs. Now we've seen the wild runs, and the conclusions were mixed in. They're still a little bit mixed here, I think. There's reasons for concern. There are some runs that are struggling. There's reason for optimism. And so we do see some runs that are increasing, wild runs that are increasing, and we've seen the cyclical nature back through time that gives us some hope too. And lastly, let me just say I appreciate Chris Kern's insert that goes back to 1946. That gives us a much better picture of things. And lastly, I very much appreciate Mr. Twight's answer with regard to how the management has been responsible in recent years. So not a question, Madam Chair, just a very strong appreciation to the staff for an excellent presentation.
Thank you. Good point. Let's go on then to Guy Norman. Are you there?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Wall. Good morning, commissioners. Thanks for the invitation. I have had the opportunity to, in my career, focused on the Columbia Basin to work for both Department of Fish and Wildlife in Washington for several decades, not quite 100 years like Commissioner McIsaac, and also about a 3-year stint with Oregon Fish and Wildlife. So this is a bit of a homecoming for me. So I appreciate the opportunity to present to you today. With the details of the presentation, I'm going to need help with control, as I don't have the setup here to control myself. So that would be greatly appreciated. I'm usually on the receiving end of these presentations in my current stint with the council, and not on the presenting side of things. So if I believe it's Nicole could put up my presentation and actually control the slide change, that'd be great.
Sure thing, Guy. What's the title of it, so I know which one I'm opening up?
So this is the Columbia Basin Partnership slides. I'll check to see if it's the right one when you put it up.
Okay. I initially have this guy. Is that guy it?
No, it's the one prior to that. It's the other one.
Okay, does that look right?
That's it. Thank you very much.
Right.
So let me just give a short background on the origin of the partnership. So it actually was launched following a public survey by NOAA, sponsored by NOAA, following the 2010 biological opinion regarding the operation of the Columbia River federal power system. And in that public survey, there was a lot of feedback, consistent feedback to NOAA regarding the need for more public input more participation by non-government organizations and the public that has diverse interests in the basin. So NOAA responded with that survey with setting up this Columbia River Partnership Task Force, which actually began with several workshops in 2016 that covered the various subjects that impact salmon and steelhead throughout the life cycle in the Columbia Basin. Following those workshops in 2016, began the actual convening of the Columbia River Partnership that operated under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, and actually was a subcommittee under NOAA's Marine Fishery Advisory Committee. So the primary focus of the partnership was to establish quantitative and qualitative goals for salmon in the basin, and do so in a collaborative process that involved all the diverse interests in the basin. I believe in your package, you do have a copy of the Phase 2 report, which was the final report submitted to MAFAC in October 2020. I would encourage commissioners to dig into that a bit. There's a lot of really good information in terms of current stock status goals, the process that led to establishing those goals, both biologically as well as the collaborative interactions in the process that took place in establishing common values and common goals by all the diverse interests in the basin. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight a unique aspect of the partnership, and that was the basin-wide approach and the participation by diverse interests in the basin. There were 32 participants representing tribes, states, fisheries interests, commercial and sport fisheries interests, a number of ports in the basin, agriculture representatives, environmental group representatives, energy utility representatives, reclamation districts, Pacific waterways. So a complete set of diverse interests at the table. And this is a picture of the folks that were involved. There were also a number of subcommittees, technical subcommittees that actually utilized expertise in the various watersheds, tribal, state, federal managers and biologists and scientists to develop the foundation for the biological work that led to developing goals. Next slide, please. So in addition to quantitative goals, the group worked together to establish qualitative goals as well regarding natural production, harvest and fisheries, hatchery, covering both conservation objectives as well as mitigation objectives and supporting fisheries. And then, of course, social, cultural, economic, and ecological considerations, which were really one of the focuses of the participants in the process and the outcomes, looking at how particular work associated with rebuilding salmon and steelhead in the basin affects the economy, cultural, social considerations, big consideration being tribal, cultural, and religious values, the importance of salmon to the tribes in the basin, and of course, broad ecosystem values such as providing food for southern resident killer whales. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to go through this sort of a general representation of the quantitative goals. There were 27 stocks in the basin that were analyzed, but a number of subpopulations within all those stocks were all individually analyzed as well. So those 27 stocks represent over 300 populations throughout the Columbia Basin, natural populations as well as hatchery production. Now the goal focus was on natural production, although there's also goals for hatchery production that are in the document as well. But the the goals for the natural production are categorized in low goals, which are basically the delisting goals for all of the different stocks, medium goals, and high goals. Now, the high goals are representative of the potential for all stocks to ascend to, but that is limited by the potential in the habitat details of the particular watershed. So there was an analysis that was conducted in terms of what is the potential if we went to full restoration of the habitat in each particular watershed. That potential doesn't reach the historical potential just because of limitations that would preclude reaching that potential in particular watersheds in today's modern situation, modern world development world. So the high goals are the total potential for spawning escapement, and then the medium goals are just simply halfway in between the low goal, which is the ESA delisting level, and the high goal, which is the potential for each population in each particular watershed. And certainly a broad goal is to reach healthy and harvestable levels for each stock, for each population in the Columbia Basin. Next slide, please. So this pie graph represents the total return to the Columbia River at the high goal level, which includes harvest as well. Harvest basically follows the runs, and as the runs become healthy and harvestable, the idea is that harvest would increase as well, where the objective would be escapement goal management. A good example of that in today's current situation is the Upriver Bright Hanford Reach Fall Chinook run. It's at a healthy and harvestable level, and the management is set up to make sure that the Upriver Bright escapement from harvest does meet the spawning escapement goal. And that's the objective for all these populations once they rebuild and get to that healthy and harvestable level. So this basically breaks down the return to the river at the highest goal, including hatchery fish. And you can see the division in the center pie between the various major stocks. And over to the right graph, it shows that return by region. I may point out there, you can see that the Upper Columbia has the highest return level with this high goal future situation. That includes reintroduction. So that would assume that over the next few decades that there would be reintroduction that would utilize the habitat currently available above Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee Dam, as well as the Snake River above Hell's Canyon Dam. So there's a reintroduction component that is in the high goals that is represented in these numbers before you. Over on the far left, there's the breakdown of natural and hatchery fish in the future in the high goal scenario. You can see it's about 3/4 natural fish and about 1/4 hatchery fish. Current situation is reversed. The returns to the river are about 3/4 hatchery fish and about 1/4 natural fish. Now, this representation does not necessarily represent reduction in hatchery fish. What it is gains in natural fish, so that proportion of natural to hatchery actually flips and is dominated by natural fish, even with the current levels of hatchery production. The hatchery production in the report represents current hatchery production, and the future also represents both near-term, long-term future represents those mitigation plans that are already in play but may not be realized yet. So this is not new hatchery programs. This is existing plus planned hatchery programs that are represented in the hatchery piece. And that concludes my partnership part of the presentation. I could take questions now, or Chair Wall, if you want to wait until I'm finished with the Columbia Basin Collaborative presentation, we could do that too.
Actually, thank you for the presentation. I don't see other hands up yet, but I have a couple questions. And first of all, I'd like to say that it's good to meet you, even if it's only your voice so far. And I agree with you that there's great information in this report, and listening to people over time about it, there really is a lot in here. And a lot of people and groups spent a lot of time and effort on this one. My takeaway when I read it, and I'd like to check if this is yours as well, is that there seemed to be a unanimous interest in defining recovery as healthy and harvestable, and reproducing populations of salmon and steelhead, and also an equally unanimous urgency to act. And is that what you would take away from it as well?
Chair Wall, I think that is a really good summary of sort of the primary focus of the partnership goals and what was agreed to by all the various interests. And the collaborative process that I'll get into here in a minute is actually sort of spawned, if you will, by the path forward that is recommended in the collaboration, that sense of urgency and a call to action.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions, and then I do see another hand up, so we'll go there. But Nikki, if we could go to the slide that has the goals on it, and it has the varying colors. I think it's number 4. Keep going, if you will, one more. And on this one, this is, Guy, pretty central to our discussion today, because we're really talking about what do we do to increase the runs and focus on conservation. And what this says, as I read it, is that we're looking at moving from ESA recovery or avoiding jeopardy as that's what we do. We have done in order to meet our conservation requirements. We've been looking at ESA recovery or avoiding jeopardy. And what this report suggests is that we move from ESA recovery to healthy and harvestable, which is significant, though it's way below historical potential. So exactly, no one is talking about trying to reach historical potential, but this seems to be saying, given what we've seen and given what's going on in the Columbia, it's important to think about moving the bar from meeting ESA to meeting healthy and harvestable, and being pretty clear in defining that. And I just want to check that that's a good read of what this report said.
Yeah, once again, Chair Wall, good summary. I think the first step, the low bar, the low goal, is moving listed fish to that delisting ESA recovery level, and we've still got a long ways to go to get there.
Yes.
For most stocks. Snake River Fall Chinook, as Bill Twite mentioned earlier, is an exception to that. But most of the stocks still have a long ways to go to get to ESA recovery. And then, yeah, the next step is reaching healthy and harvestable levels, which will vary depending on the habitat potential in each system. But yeah, the bottom line is let's move past ESA recovery. Let's get to broad sense goals that lead to healthy population in the basin. And of course, that's going to take bold actions and the region getting together to provide the weight of the region to get behind those particular actions.
Thank you. Let's go to Vice Chair Woolley, who had his hand up next.
Okay, thank you, Chair Wall. So regarding the high goals and your slide with the pie graphs and showing that 76-26 or 76-24% percentages that we'd like to flip, into the future for natural and hatchery. Did the task force go as far as to talk about timelines, or did it just stay sort of at the goals level for now?
Well, thank you, Commissioner Woolley. That is a good question. So we did begin with timelines associated with low, medium, and high goals. Whereas low goals were within 25 years, mediums within 50, and high within 100 years. But the further we went into the process, we did not want to have that be a message that we want to wait 25 years to meet recovery, and a recognition that different stocks will go at different paces depending on the particular situation, what's ailing the fish in that particular watershed, etc. So we didn't want to be bound by the message that we're not going to get to medium goals for 50 years. We want to get there as fast as possible. So we sort of avoided attaching specific number of years to those particular low, medium, high goals. But we did have the conversation, and I think realistically, for some populations in particular, this is a long haul. But you got to start, and you've got to bring to move it in that direction. You've got to begin and have that dedication that's going to last for generations.
All right, thank you, Guy.
Commissioner Carpenter, Chair Carpenter.
You're muted, Larry.
Thank you for that. Guy, thank you for the presentation. They're very, very helpful. I have one question, I think, and on this slide that we're looking at, and I'd like your interpretation and futuristic perspective on. If I look at the blue pie chart where it has Upper Columbia on top, and it looks like, I haven't done the math, but it's about half of the available fish opportunities, I guess we have to work with. Has the group that's worked on this tried to provide some direct guidance into where, what, and how we're going to upgrade the Upper Columbia, being it's the major producer? I know it's a big area, but I mean, do you have any thoughts, or has it been discussed on priority A, B, C in the Upper Columbia section?
So thank you, Chair Carpenter. So a couple things. One, there has been work conducted through the Power and Conservation Council's program, Fish and Wildlife program, on researching the potential for habitat. What's the habitat potential for the various stocks up there, as well as beginning at least discussions on what are the possibilities for passage, for adult and juvenile passage. And just coincidentally, after the commissioners meeting here, I'm going to join, already in progress, another forum, which is led by the Bureau Reclamation. That is a diverse group of interest discussing the possibilities for Upper Columbia reintroduction. So there's work in place. These particular numbers represent the habitat potential, and also include hatchery fish that would be used for the reintroduction. The numbers here are dominated by sockeye. Lots of historical sockeye production above Grand Coulee Dam prior to being cut off with no passage in the dams. So there's a lot of sockeye in here, but there's also a lot of summer Chinook and spring Chinook and steelhead as well. So hopefully that answers your question. There's work in place. Certainly all the answers aren't there, but there's forums that are at least exploring the possibilities.
If I could ask a brief follow-up, Guy, and it's maybe not even doable, but do you have any sense of timeline? I mean, you said, well, we don't really want to wait 25 years, and so we're talking about it, but do you have a sense of movement and any type of a time linkage?
Commissioner Carpenter, specific to the Upper Columbia or just in general?
In general, that would be fine, yeah.
Yeah, I think, and of course, we're going to get into the Columbia Basin Collaborative discussion. I think, certainly the call to action and processes to get to action, I think are immediate. And in terms of response, you recognize the life cycle of salmon, improving habitat and other conditions for increasing survival take a while in order to see the response. So I think that within 25 years is probably realistic in general, but I think there could be a faster timeline for some stocks that are at least starting in better shape than others, and that may respond more quickly to actions that really target on what the main source of impact are.
Thank you for that, Guy. We very much appreciate it.
Yeah, just to follow, I think it's basically it's sort of it'll be variable depending on populations.
Yeah.
Look forward to hearing more in the future.
Okay. Oh, sorry to interrupt. So just to clarify, the 25-year goal is the delisting goal. Is that correct?
Yeah, within 25 years.
Within 25 years. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, one more question from Commissioner McIsaac, and then we'll go right into your second presentation, Guy, if you will.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nikki, I wonder if you could move back to slide number 4. And I'd also like to thank Council Member Guy Norman for coming here today and giving this presentation, and the next one as well. On this particular slide, this refers to those salmon runs that are listed maybe it refers to a lot more than that, but anyway, it seems to focus a little bit on listed. There are some runs that are not listed, and there are some runs that are already in the healthy and harvestable category. So my question is, did the task force get into any recommendations relative to the mix of fisheries or fishing pressure that would go in the mix here, I guess, in terms of moving forward for those populations that are listed to get them into the green? Did they get into that at all?
Thank you, Commissioner McIsaac. So yeah, first of all, the task force analyzed all populations, including the healthy and harvestable. So this graph is supposed to represent all of those populations, including Upper Bright Fall Chinook, Lewis River Fall Chinook, those that are healthy and harvestable, those that aren't listed. Vast majority are listed. In terms of analyzing the various sources of impact, you mentioned fisheries. There was biological analysis that was done in coordination with the various experts in the various watersheds and just managers throughout the basin in terms of what per stock, what the level of impact by the particular sources of impact are, which of course varies by stock. And those sources of impact included harvest, hydro, habitat, predation, hatchery, blocked area, and all of the various sources of impact. So there is a table that you can find in the report that does get into that, and it it's represented by the 27 stocks, and it's a general. I would guess I'd qualify that as a general representation, but it was put together by with coordination with the experts in the basin. So I would say at least get you in the ballpark of the relative impacts of the relative sources of impact by stock. In terms of analyzing fisheries specifically, what is done in the report is breaking down fisheries harvest by stock, by source, ocean impact, ocean fisheries, in-river fisheries, treaty, non-treaty, tributary, etc. So there's a breakdown of the harvest in the appendices, as well as habitat and predation and the rest of the hydro, rest of the sources of impact that gets into that kind of detail. In terms of the sort of the, where do you go from here in terms of actions associated with the various sources of impact? That's the business that's being set up with the Columbia Basin Collaborative.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Shall we go right to your second presentation, Councilwoman?
That sounds good. Thank you. So why don't we just jump right to the second slide if we could. So this looks like a continuation of the partnership, but it actually belongs under the collaborative presentation. At least that's the way I set it up. Just sort of representing, and I think responded to this in an earlier question by a commissioner, is that you know, the path forward said we need, basically all agreed we need to turn this plan into action to reach the goals. A call to action, a sense of urgency. Let's maintain the principles and the values that were represented in the partnership. Let's use sound science, and let's recognize, you know, part of the mission statement of the partnership is that recovering salmon leads to healthy ecosystem and a vibrant quality of life in the basin for the human population as well. Also calling for bold actions, as you can see here. So this is one of the directives that launched the Columbia Basin Collaborative. Next slide, please. So, of course, the next step was the four governors signed a four-state agreement acknowledging the roles of the various diverse interests in the basin, including the governments and the tribes, and directing the states to set up a process to advance the goals of the partnership and establish a framework to advance these goals that included a broad-based participation, accountability, tribal rights, supporting fisheries and river-dependent economies, and also support state clean energy goals and an efficient, reliable, and affordable energy system, which is, you know, certainly related to the quality of life in the basin. Next slide, please. So I should mention also that there were a number of other processes that also led to the four-state agreement signed by the four governors. There was a coordination forum that was put together, led by Elliot Mainzer, the former CEO of Bonneville Power Administration. And that included states and federal entities and tribes, basically coordinating life after the Columbia River System Operation, EIS, that was in its final stages in 2020, where in that NEPA process, the federal government was tasked with analyzing options for the hydro system relative to meeting objectives for salmon and steelhead in the basin under the Endangered Species Act. And Bonneville Power and other federal executives set up this discussion to talk about life after the NEPA process, using the NEPA process as a springboard for broader conversations in terms of meeting beyond ESA delisting objectives for Columbia River salmon and steelhead. So that group was working on sort of setting up for the collaborative as well as the partnership. There were also some meetings that were being conducted that included environmental groups, utilities, and some tribal representatives about the same subject. How do we have the region work together in a process beyond ESA legal requirements to advance rebuilding a salmon in the basin. So this was actually a very a precedent-setting kind of a relationship between the various interests that set up a situation themselves, whereas they would continue this discussion about, how do we meet salmon goals collaboratively and cover the other interests in the basin along the way. And what I'm showing in this slide is that after the governors, well, before and after the governors signed a four-state letter of agreement, there were letters from various constituency groups encouraging the governors to take a leadership role and move forward on a collaborative process. And after the four-state agreement was signed, follow-up letters by stakeholders continuing to represent support for such a process. Next slide, please. So the Columbia Basin Collaborative set up an ad hoc planning group with four state representatives, as well as some invited federal representatives from NOAA Fisheries and Bonneville Power, and a tribal representative to help us make sure that we were moving forward with tribal interests as a major focus. What the guiding principles that have been established in those planning sessions are certainly this would be a process that has a regional scope. So basin-wide, continue the basin-wide scope, focused on outcomes, certainly moving forward with actions that make a difference, and a sense of urgency in the process, being nimble and opportunistic. So as this process proceeds, make sure that we understand where opportunities may be, and being able to be nimble enough to guide results to take advantage of those particular opportunities that may present themselves. Be effective. So meaningful actions that actually move the dial towards this harvest and healthy goal for the various populations. Being inclusive, certainly this participation that continues to include broad, diverse interests, as well as tribal interests, and provides the same sort of a cultural setup that was set up in the partnership. Knowledgeable. One of the things that we've really stressed is if this process is going to be meaningful, we need to utilize existing information. There's a plethora of information that's been developed in this basin: science information, management information, and understanding of the various interests in the basin. Leverage that existing information, that existing expertise found in existing forums, for example, as sort of the catalyst for moving forward. And then, of course, being timely, a sense of urgency. Let's don't just set up something that's a process that continues process. We need a process that leads to actions in short time, but is also durable for the long term. Like I mentioned earlier, this is going to have to continue for decades to get to where we want to be with the salmon populations. Next slide, please. So here is, I want to spend a little time on this particular process diagram. So this is something that the state's state-led ad hoc working group has been working on for since last fall. That I think we have got this to the point where we're pretty comfortable with it in terms of the process that leads to recommending actions and actually getting those actions to implementation. So let me start with saying that the new process is really associated with that circle. I don't know what color you're seeing, maybe sort of a light pink circle in the middle. If you go to the top and look at the rectangular blue box, sovereigns and other regional entities, that is really existing governance, existing authority, existing forums that are in charge with the authority to implement particular actions for salmon and steelhead, related to salmon and steelhead. So the idea here is that recommendations coming out of this process, hopefully with consensus, would actually use existing authorities for implementation. And you can see that those we've represented, 3 different paths for authority and implementation. One being existing regional forums. You mentioned the Pacific Fisheries Management Council today. That's one. There's several. There's the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. You have state recovery boards, for example. There's a number of forums in the basin that have authority, that have the direction to manage certain aspects and make decisions that affect salmon recovery. Proposals to Congress with that could mean authorization, new authorization, also could mean budgets. So appropriations. I think we all recognize that have been in this salmon management for a while that we fall short of money to do everything that we really need to do for salmon. And then there's also implementation on the far right by regional sovereigns, federal, state, and tribal. The Fish and Wildlife Commissions are one of those bodies that have policy authority. And there's a number of state tribal councils, federal government authorities, Migratory Bird Act, for example, Marine Mammal Protection Act, a number of those authorities that would be instrumental in implementing any particular actions that go through this process. So let me drop into now into the circle, the new process. So what we're envisioning, first of all, is we have a project team in the yellow box up there that's led by the 4 states that really, and I would say that's not the 4 states being the main voice in this process. This is mainly sort of a representation of responsibility to carry out the 4-state process as per the governor's direction. So developing the scope and the agenda and the assignments and process coordination, et cetera, would fall on the states. The box below that, or the rectangle, the integration recommendation group would be responsible for working through the feasibility and developing recommendations for implementation. And this would be the group that would be responsible to carry recommendations on up to the existing sovereigns processes. And so if you look to the right of that box, we've got suggested membership, which would include the 4 states, federal agency representation, Columbia Basin Tribe representation, and then the stakeholders we've actually divided into 4 kind of general sectors: environmental NGOs, utilities, river economies, and fisheries. We're still working out on the number of representatives, but I'll just say with the stakeholders, I think we're leaning towards 2 from each sector. That'd be a total of 8 stakeholders at the table. And we're trying to keep this table at a manageable level, but recognizing that we need to balance between appropriate representation and kind of having an efficient process with that group that's able to work through and discuss, deliberate on various recommendations that come from the topic-specific work groups. So I'll move down to that box down at the bottom. So this is where we see the bulk of the work occurring. This is where we will have topic-specific work groups associated with all the various issues. And when I say the issues, there's 6 categories. I think we all know them: hydro, habitat, hatcheries, predation, blocked areas, harvest. There would be specific work groups working through each one of those broad subjects. The idea would be, and we're setting up a proposed criteria, biological criteria, that would take a look at stock status and relative impacts, and set up a matrix situation where stocks in poor shape that have high impacts, though on a particular source of impact, that kind of action would sort of rise to the top, or it would rise to the top in terms of analyzing the potential for actions. I should put it that way. So that's, let me use predation as example. So if you have different stocks that have different levels of predation that are represented in the Columbia River Partnership analysis, we would take a look at, or this group would look at stocks that have low abundance, the lowest abundance with the highest impact on predation, and then dig into what's the source of that predation, what's the major source for that stock, what area in the basin does it occur? Does it occur up in the upper Columbia, the Snake, or in the estuary? And worked on, if indeed that's, let me use an example. Snake River steelhead, upper Columbia steelhead, poor shape. We know bird predation is a primary source for steelhead, more so than other salmonids. And that would rise to the top. Now, once you get to that situation where you sort of single out as a high priority bird predation on steelhead, you would advance to the feasibility stage. And we want to get to the feasibility stage sort of as the bulk of the work. The feasibility stage would also bring in, if you look to the left box there, subject-specific input from regional forums. Expertise is what I would call that. It would also have not just regional forums, but also expertise in various authorities, what's being done at this point in time, where's the gaps, what are the impediments to implementation or doing something more, what are the opportunities, do we have Migratory Bird Act under the predation example I just gave you, that limitations that need to be addressed, et cetera. Funding, are there funding limitations that need to be addressed? So the feasibility stage would sort of get into the bulk of the work once the biological analysis sort of sees what rises to the top for more analysis. Once the work group gets done with that particular process, it moves back up to the integration recommendation group. And I should say the integration recommendation group will be responsible for establishing priorities, what work gets done first, for example, or is there a couple of the issues that are addressed at the same time? So that's part of what the responsibility of that group would be. And so once the analysis is done, feasibility, you can see, continues, with interaction with the integration recommendation group and expertise. Once that's all fleshed out and we have the discussion about the recommendation, the idea is that there's consensus, or if there's not consensus, there's opportunity for minority opinion. But moving back up to the box that I started talking about, which is the implementation box with existing authority, the idea would be that there would be the political weight of the region being on board that would help influence decisions in these existing authorities. So one of the things that we're working on is how we we populate the membership. And so that's part of the work still to be done. But I know that's a whole lot, but I want to spend some time on this because I think it's sort of the main guts of the process. And it's taken a lot of work and a lot of discussion. We had a February workshop. We got good feedback from stakeholders and sovereign representatives that I think we applied some of that input into this latest version of the process. So next slide, please. I think this is my last slide. So moving forward, as I indicated, we did have this February 24th workshop. We're going to continue with working on establishing the work group and implementation recommendation group membership, develop options for funding. If we're going to run this thing the way we want to, we're going to need funding, and we have members of the group like Jim McKenna from the Oregon Governor's Office and myself that are working on options for funding. And we're working on a charter that we want to have ready to go for the first actual convening of this group. And we plan on early fall to get this process underway. And I should mention, we do have another workshop meeting on June 10th. So that's coming right up to present the progress we've made since February and get some more input from both stakeholders and sovereigns that we can consider before we actually launch the process. So that completes my presentation. Be happy to take questions.
We do have a hand up, and I'll ask Commissioner Woolley to ask that question in just a minute. And I wanted to check with you though, Guy, do you have time to be here through the next presentation, which is Tucker Jones, and it's very related to this? You said you had something else as well.
I do. The Upper Columbia reintroduction group actually lasts till 2 o'clock. I've alerted them that I may not join till after lunch. So yes, I anticipated it would be useful for me to be around.
That's terrific. Thank you. Very interesting presentation, an enormous amount of work. Let's go to Commissioner Woolley's question, and then we'll go right into Tucker's presentation because these are so closely related. I bet there'll be other questions for you, Guy, as well as for Tucker at the end of his. So Vice Chair Woolley.
Okay, well, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question, and thank you, Guy, for that overview, and especially for walking us through the flow chart on slide 6. I looked at that last night, and I thought I really would like somebody to walk me through this because it's fairly complex and detailed, and so thank you so much for that. And maybe just pulling one of the suggested expertise membership categories out as a question. For instance, one you have is recreation. Are you talking specifically and only about fishing, or are you talking about other forms of recreation as well?
It's a broad explanation of recreation. It would include fisheries. It would include other uses, rafting, other recreational uses throughout the basin. And we had that. We did have representation in the partnership of broader recreational uses.
Okay, yeah, I was just curious because you have fisheries as a category, then you have recreation, and I assume fisheries is more of on the management side. Recreation would be more of the the human activities. So yeah, I was just curious about that. I do appreciate all the different areas of membership that you're including on this list. And I know how challenging it is to get representatives from all these groups and to keep these groups manageable. It's a challenge, and I don't envy that, but I know you have help. So thank you again.
Thank you, Commissioner Woolley. I might I might mention that you reminded me of this. I know that The experience early on in the partnership was many of us thought that we were successful as everybody showed up at the next meeting. And so they're just kind of given the history of, you know, the conflicts in the basin. Many didn't have a lot of hope for this to be successful. We were pleasantly surprised as they worked through the process, how relationships were developed. People gained a appreciation for the interests of the other people. And so it was an experience that we, some of us weren't expecting, that perhaps have been around too long in the basin, but actually it encouraged me and gave me some optimism for moving forward on this.
Yeah, what I've found is when that effort is evident to be as inclusive as possible, there's a lot of appreciation for that, especially organizations that have felt marginalized over time in these sorts of discussions. And so when they're included, it really goes a long ways for that collaborative effort to move forward.
I agree.
Guy, thanks again. And we will be coming back to you with questions, including probably the one that Vice Chair Baker asked earlier. Let's go now to Tucker Jones with talking about SARS and the connections to the Columbia Basin Partnership Report, if you will, please.
Thank you, Chair Wall, Chair Carpenter, Commission members, Directors Melcher and Susuwin. For the record, I'm Tucker Jones, the Ocean Salmon and Columbia River Program Manager. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, it worked earlier, so I'm gonna try to share my screen again and we will see how that goes. So can everyone see the presentation now?
Yes, it's good.
All right, so thanks. Yes, today I'm gonna just talk a little bit about how those goals, specifically the natural production goals out of the partnership, relate to sort of some of the productivity measures you've heard me talk about, also the small to adult recovery rates. So going to hit on, you know, those quantitative goals first, and then follow that up with SARS, and then some of the other things that, you know, roles or potential places for the commissions to engage. So let's see, can we advance? There we go. All right. As Guy mentioned, the partnership has developed quantitative goals for all the populations. This is his sort of figure revisited. I'm not going to really dwell on it too much, other than to say he sort of hit on the rolled up goals for the basin. And I'd like to drill down on this a little bit so that you can get, you know, at the relationship to, you know, these natural abundance goals and productivity. So we have those goals basin-wide, but we also have them, you know, drilled down to the population level. And I know these are small, but all of this information is sort of in that phase 2 report. I just wanted to make sure people could get the example. So here's what these goals look like for spring Chinook in the Snake River. And I know that I keep coming back to Snake River spring Chinook throughout sort of the course of the presentations at these meetings, but that's because, you know, this is really where we have the most information available to us in terms of, you know, not just abundance goals, but in those productivity goals. You can see we have natural production goals, you know, for, see if I can get my mouse to work. Hopefully people can see that. You know, generally sort of the ESU, but also at the MPG level, the major population group, and then down specifically to the you know, population level. We have these as, you know, low, medium, and high goals. Low being sort of those, you know, MAT goals rolled up. That would be sort of your delisting criteria. You know, wrapped up in that delisting, you know, would be the other sort of delisting criteria. So not just abundance, but, you know, productivity and diversity and distribution. And then you have your high range goals and sort of an interstitial space. There are time ranges associated with this. I think it's important, you know, when Guy talked about, timeframes there. The within the timeframe is really important, and that was really important to the partnership members who were there. I think there was one of the things in my sort of observations of the partnership that made it work was that it was sort of a safe space. There was a general respect that and rapport that had been built, and people felt safe, airing, things that they thought were going well and things that were maybe frustrating to them. And one of the things, maybe not universally expressed, but certainly within a broad group, was a frustration about potentially resetting, the timelines. When NOAA first listed a bunch of these populations, the delisting goals were within 25 years, and that was in, starting in the 90s. And so if you're meeting again in 2017 to reset the timelines at 25 years, there was some frustration on that. So they weren't, 25 goals, they were no longer than sort of, that was what the within was categorized in there. So we have these for both currently accessible areas, and we have them for blocked areas, this guy said. So we have these, an upstream of Hell's Canyon as well. Although, so we have, even though we try, I think, as fish biologists, to develop a common currency, we do struggle sometimes. We talk about river mouth goals or abundances at Bonneville. The partnership looked, and for most of the quantitative goals, although they did try to back them down in many places to river mouths and apply the different mortality rates and fisheries assumptions that were in there, they tried to also look at just escapement goals. So here, so for the Snake River Spring Chinook, we have a high end goal of 138,000 naturally produced spring Chinook in the currently accessible areas, and an additional 21,000 or so in the blocked areas upstream of Hell's Canyon Dam. We're going to focus sort of on this as we move forward. So again, these are escapements to the spawning ground, and even I, within my own, I'm going to talk about in my next slide. These are those numbers sort of backed down to, these are abundances at Lower Granite, and I'm going to talk about them in relation to our goals. So in future slides, I'll back those goal numbers down to Lower Granite. I'll show you those numbers back down. This again looks similar, same sort of trends that Bill and Chris showed, but these are again just to Lower Granite. So you can see they're going to be a little bit lower than those Columbia River mouth goals that you saw earlier. But one thing I might mention, although we worry a little bit about, or not worry a little bit about, but although we think that because of some of these add-ons, our abundance numbers, it may not look a lot better than the mid 90s. I think maybe Bill or Chris talked about this briefly. I think, honestly, we're in a substantially better place than we were in the mid 90s, just because of so many of the actions we fought for and taken to date, especially those hydro actions that have increased, not just direct survival at the dam, but, increased survival throughout their life cycle. So I think, no one would deny that environmental conditions, both freshwater and ocean conditions, impact overall returns. If we hadn't taken those actions, I would be pretty scared about where we would be right now. So although the absolute numbers may not be different than the 90s, where we are at with the protections in place is in a lot better place. So, we see sort of those things scaled to each other in the previous graph. Here, I've tried to look at how things are scaled to the partnership goals. And when you put those partnership goals on, if you back that 138,000 down to Lower Granite Dam from the spawning grounds, you wind up with a high end goal of almost 180,000 and a low goal of 33,500. And you can see that, while we've sort of clipped that low goal a couple of times over the last, 40 years, we're consistently below that. And there's actually quite a bit of a ways to go to these high end goals. In fact, we've been below these numbers long enough, and we're in a place recently now. You guys might have heard about some analysis recently that came out from the Nez Perce tribe. Again, speaking, I guess things are bad. About 40%, these are aggregated returns, again, to the basin. When you think about these as their individual populations, about 40% of the spring Chinook populations in the Snake River Basin are currently at or below the quasi-extinction threshold or the QET threshold. And that doesn't mean that, that they're extinct or extirpated, but it means that, they're currently at levels that are below where we know can respond. And forecasts, moving forward are not over the next several years with what we're anticipating from the National Marine Fisheries Service and NOAA for ocean conditions are not looking, particularly better for that. So I think there is a real, echoing other sentiments from earlier today, sense of urgency in the basin amongst stakeholders, tribes, and states. So, trying to step through this relatively quickly, we talked, we know what those abundance goals are. How do they relate to productivity? Just briefly, we have ways to go. How do we get there? And how do we know we're on our way? Well, recall, we have to know that our populations are growing. To get to an abundance level, you just can't do a mechanistic fix. You have to have these natural populations increasing. And we measure that, that increases in productivity. When those are increasing, we know, is that in response to an external factor? Are the populations increasing or decreasing? And if you focus purely on abundance, you can mask some of those external factors. The smolt to adult return rates are an easily understood indicator of productivity. They're, again, revisiting this, basically determined by the number of returning adults per 100 juveniles. So if 2 adults return from 100 smolts, you have an SAR of 2%. To get to the natural production abundance goals in the partnership, population productivity needs to be high enough that the populations are increasing at increasing at a rate that will allow us to achieve our rates within the sort of time frames to achieve those goals. But what rate is high enough? Well, that's an interesting question. The Power and Conservation Council that Guy sits on is really for a long time had established goals of 2 to 6% with an average of 4%. And if we have those goals at higher than 4%, that'll give us sustained population growth. In 2 to 4%, we're sort of in a mixed response, and less than 2%, really we're looking at populations declining throughout the region. So these, as I said, they've been around for quite a while, these goals. Are they, compatible with the abundance goals put together in the partnership? The short answer is yes, right? When we have plotted out a regression of actual SARs and their corresponding returns to lower granite, we get a line, that basically looks like this blue one through the center here. The shading around this is the 95% confidence interval. But basically you can see that, when we're talking in our range, we're looking in our, 2 to 6% range to get to that. And really need to be around 4%. But how have we been doing with regards to those goals? And as you can see, again, looking at Snake River Spring Chinook SARs, not that well of late. Our 10-year average has been about 0.65%. So again, returning to that example, for every 100 smolts that have left, 0.65 adults are returning on average over the last 10 years. We have a couple of times when we get into the sort of 2% range, but really we have a ways to go to get to that sustained goal. So what can we do to sort of try to move the needle and move us to that place? And what can the commissions do? Well, the easiest dial for the commissions, and by extension the agencies, to turn is fisheries. But if you remember, this figure is one I showed you guys in January. Fisheries are actually a pretty small component of the overall mortality that Columbia Basin spring Chinook are going to face. Really the region needs to continue to push for broad solutions, including, those outlined this past spring in concept by, Congressman Simpson and sort of taken up by Governor Brown and I think Congressman Blumenauer at this point in time. And those things are really looking to recover, those concepts are looking to recover salmon while keeping all the other regional interests in the whole, trying to address the suite of factors impacting fish, especially hydro impacts. So I think, in addition to the sort of fisheries dial and keeping in mind that, most of the sometimes the tongue does not want to work. Most of the conservation in fisheries is already in place, right? These weak stock, mixed stock fisheries, those that are listed, we're, holding those impacts to 2% or less in most cases. So there's a lot of, most of the conservation there is already baked in. But, the commissions do, I think, have a voice in these, larger regional conversations. Your regional leaders on fish and wildlife, conservation and recovery issues, and so are your respective agencies. So what are some of the things that can be done? Well, we have the collaborative setting up. That is a regional process, as Guy mentioned. And I'm glad he walked us through the figure too, Commissioner Woolley, because it's a pretty complicated construct as it is right now. But these are complicated issues. And so I think, I think it would be naive to think that, complicated issues could be solved without a complicated process. So this is hopefully setting up to be a vehicle that can help the region find, some pathways to reach those partnership goals. All right, there we go. So what are maybe some of those projected pathways? Now, keeping our 4% goal in mind and, knowing that we need actions to address, hydro mortality for these interior basins. And, keeping in mind that sort of past and really current operations have not, our 10-year average these days is about 0.65, are not high enough. If we spill to 125% to the max we think we can safely do throughout the basin, well, that can and will help in the near term. But really, options that consider breach are the only pathways that consistently achieve the necessary long-term SARs and provide a buffer against some of the negative climate effects that I think we're already starting to see. I think that's hopefully what the collaborative is setting up to address in the next year, take on some of those tough conversations and address some of those concepts that have been laid out this past spring and see where it goes from there. And that is what I have for you today. If you have any questions, please let me know now. And let's see if I can now stop sharing my screen.
We do have a question right away from Don McIsaac, from Commissioner McIsaac. So let's go to that one while Tucker is changing his screen. And commissioners, if there are questions also of additional questions of Guy Norman, we can ask those now. We are running behind schedule significantly. So rather than take a break, maybe if you need to take a break, just take a quick one and come right back, and we will keep going. So let's go to Commissioner McIsaac for a quick question, and then we're going to move to Vice Chair Baker and start working on some of these issues and questions for the commissioners. So Commissioner McIsaac.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll be very brief. The question has to do with the slide, wild spring Chinook mortality rate by source. I think it's slide number 9, up on page 4 or 5. And it shows ocean and river fisheries at about a 10% mortality rate, but pinnipeds much lower than that. And I'm not sure if this includes Willamette spring Chinook, which have a heavier ocean harvest rate than upriver spring Chinook that are more pelagic. But I thought that the pinniped mortality rate was one of those studies that had it at about half the run. So upriver run, it would be upriver run. And so I know there was a problem at Willamette Falls for a while too. So my question directly is, that pinniped bar looks kind of low. What's the source for that in comparison to the others?
Mr. McIsaac, this is not including the Willamette piece in there. This is focused on the Columbia. The Willamette piece on the sea lions as well was especially focused on steelhead, wild winter steelhead, really pushing on that as a source of mortality. So I would note that this isn't, a fully inclusive list of mortality sources as well, right? The ocean isn't included on this. So just sort of focused on external things.
Okay, maybe I'll follow up later on the pinniped part then. Thanks.
Thanks.
Chris, I do have one question, and it's more an observation because I don't know yet how to frame the question. But one of the things you talked about is the sense of urgency, which we have heard and read about over and over again. And I think you and others have made the point well today that it'd be worse without the management actions that we've had. And now we have climate change in front of us as well. We have more frequent, as we've heard from you and others in the past, we will have more frequent low water flows, high temperatures. We're looking at droughts and those sorts of things. So is it, I just want to make sure that we should not walk away today with the message that things are okay. I think I heard Commissioner Baker say it's cyclical and these stocks are struggling. It would be worse today, far worse, if we hadn't done all of the management we have. And what I'm taking from your discussion about SARS is, and the basin work, is that now we have a big choice about some bold actions that we need to take if we're going to maintain where we are and move toward harvestable and healthy. So I don't want to overread what I've heard, but I also want to make sure that I am not hearing that things are fine and we don't need bold actions. We've done great things so far with our management. We need to do even more.
Chair, well, yeah, I don't think you're hearing me say, or Chris say, or Bill say, or Guy say today that everything is fine. I think there is a sense of urgency throughout the basin. I think what you have heard us say today, and well, and frankly, you've heard me say, I think, a bunch of times, and so not to sound like a broken record, but that much of the conservation burden that can be found in fisheries, and especially in river fisheries, that has been taken. And we have turned that dial quite extremely, I think, to the extent that there is not a lot left to turn in that dial and move the needle on productivity or an abundances left within the basin. And I think that, again, you've heard me say this a bunch, having fisheries in river is an important component to conservation. Keeping people on the water, fishing, angling, provides a connection to the resource that I think, isn't impossible. Certainly there are, folks who, lots of folks who appreciate the intrinsic value of just knowing fish that are out there. But that I think there are lots of folks that having that just real tangible connection keeps them tied to the resource in a way that they might not otherwise be. And so I think, being able to prosecute our fisheries in ways that that don't impede recovery is an important part of that recovery.
Thank you. That helps. Let's go then to Vice Chair Baker and talk about the conservation commonalities that we have between the two states, the state of Oregon rules and the state of Washington in policy. And we are, as I said, running late, so we're not going to take a break and we'll just go right into this one. So Vice Chair Baker.
Well, thank you, Chair Wall. I wanted to begin by noting that I'm not staff as I was listed on the agenda, but tell you the truth, I'm actually more comfortable in that role than as a policymaker. But I've been asked to moderate this discussion and trying to figure out why I was asked that. I think it's because I've noted a few times that while both our states are very well intentioned in this effort to achieve concurrency of our management of the Columbia River and its basin, we have at times, we have at times been talking past each other. So I'd like for us not to do that anymore. I think we all know that fishery management, Columbia River, is very complex. We've had 3 meetings now to get background information, both on the current circumstances and also on what others are doing to help with recovery. So now here we are. It's time for us to start working in earnest on a Columbia River policy that will lead to concurrent management of this spectacular resource. So our job is to take all that input coupled with the truly important information that we've received, not only from staff, but from interest groups and people, some of whom are listening today. I think many people know a lot about this resource and many have different motivations, but I think everybody says that we want to support the resource and recover it. So we need to, in part of that, determine where our authority as Fish and Wildlife Commission begins and ends, and then begin to make some decisions. Obviously, failure isn't an option, but succeeding is going to require us to keep our minds open, voice our opinions without falling into old rhetoric or taking sides in never-ending disputes, and also making real sure that we keep abreast of what the collaborative, the partnership, our legislatures and our governors are doing. And that was, I thought Guy Norman's presentation on that was wonderful. Just noting that harmonizing our 2 states' approaches is challenging in that even our regulatory foundations are different. You guys, Oregon manages by rule, we manage by policy, but the end result is the same, and we should be able to come up with something that works for both states and, more importantly, for the fish. So fishery management to me seems to break down into essentially 2 general categories. One's conservation, which includes habitat, hydro, and predation. And then there's allowable gear and fishery allocation. As you noted at the beginning of this, Chair Wall, we've taken a detour to look at conservation first. There's a reason for that, and that is that on the surface, conservation of this resource is the category in which the 2 states seem to have most agreement, at least with the documents that guide management. Your rules are very, very strong on conservation. Our state's rules are quite strong on conservation. Both of our states say all the right things. So what we need to do is begin to be clear about what we mean by that word. Obviously, it isn't enough to just say we believe in conservation, but we need to figure out where our opportunities and limits are in that area. We need to agree on both the scope of general conservation and then scope as it's applied to fisheries, and then specific actions that we can take to give meaning to the word. And then lastly, it's been pointed out over and over that there's an urgent need and we have to be bold. We need to know what we need to be bold on, and that's what we need to agree on, and that's what needs to go into our plans. So, so that's what I wanted to say to begin this discussion. If we can agree on our conservation goals, we can then go on in the next meeting or two to where the rubber hits the road for us, which is gear and allocation. It would be nice if we can take a few notes on this portion of the discussion, because what I hope to have is a real discussion amongst commissioners. There will be no PowerPoint. I wouldn't know how to share a screen if I even tried. And we can do it one of two ways, but I believe the best way to do it is to have commissioners, at least the 7 of us that are represented here, just make a short statement of what you think our opportunities and limitations are and what you think we're here to do. And then if we have time, we can begin to go through the spreadsheet that I began, but our able staff completed, that actually compares our conservation goals. There's a few places where there are differences. There are a few places where we may need to subtract or more likely add to what we're doing. But we can go through that. But I'd actually like to hear from us, from each of us, how you think we should roll up what we've learned in this now 3 meetings and how we should proceed. All right, you guys, this is
There
our
we go. Commissioner Baker, I appreciate very much that you were willing to start us through this conversation. This gets to the part where we all get a chance to say something. And I think we could take a lesson, if you will, from what Guy described and what others have described. I think that Tucker even said that the partnership got to be a place where you could have a safe conversation. We need to have one of those no-fault conversations where we're willing to put things on the table and it's a no-fault kind of conversation. You asked a great question, I think, which is what do we see as the opportunities? I'll mention just a couple and then open it up to others as well. One of the opportunities that we seem to, from all of this information we have gotten and from the urgency that we're hearing about from various places, and I think all feel ourselves in terms of looking at our conservation, is let's talk about what the bar should be. Do we want to be the ones that look at, or be one of the groups that seriously looks at changing the bar from avoid jeopardy to something higher than that? Do we want to be the ones who say we're going to be bold enough to say we're shooting for something more than avoid jeopardy and moving into the harvestable and healthy range? And though that's a giant step, when you look at some of the charts like the one that Tucker showed us, it's also far, far below historical. And I think that it's worth noting as an aside that I agree with Tucker that we've kind of wrung the sponge of harvest. As there's still gains to be made there, but that's not where we can find our big gains now in terms of clamping down on harvest. We have to look at the broader solutions. I think that so discussing changing the bar, I think, is our first step, and we've been leading to that for quite a while. The other one, I think, is discussing what it would look like if we, for instance, unleashed our staff and said, we're going to look at harvest and harvestable and healthy, unleash staff and say, what would it look like to increase these runs? We have already heard from people what they think it would take, and I think that's, where we should go with some of these discussions is, what are the actions in the face of climate change that could make a difference in this region and protect this spectacular resource? And I think that, I can't even remember who said it, but the last thing I would mention now, and then we could really open it up, is we do have a role and a responsibility, I guess, in having a voice in this broader discussion. There are, as we saw from Guy Norman, already there's a lot in place. We have a role, we can step into that, but I think the first question again is changing the bar or of conservation and what it means. I don't see other hands up yet, but I bet that there are other commissioners that are ready to jump in and have thoughts on this. Chair Carpenter. I think you might be muted.
Sorry about that. I'll be real brief. I could go back to my notes from our previous two meetings, but I just highlighted a few things that my takeaway was today. And I'll name a few of those because it's sort of a trend that creates grave concern in my mind. You know, one of the first things I noted was A run steelhead, bad. I underlined bad. B run steelhead, very bad. Then I made a note about the blob and the concerns of the blob, how often it's going to happen, El Nino, et cetera, in the future, expanding warm water regimes off the whole Pacific coast up into the Gulf of Alaska. The other, and I'm just going to name these off, and other people can chime in as they see fit. But I heard, I think it was Guy talked about the reintroduction of primarily Chinook, I believe, in the Upper Columbia. I'd like to know more about that. I understand the concept. I'd like to know more about the abundance, the frequency, the spread, how we're going to try and use that to solve some of the conservation issues that we have. The other note I made on my pad here is ESA recovery. Slow at best, or non-existent. And then somebody said, I think it was a Guy, if it wasn't with someone else, a bleak future per NOAA. Well, I guess I'm going to say that maybe at our next meeting, we'll have someone from NOAA here. I want to know more about that. I just don't want to assume that they have a hammer, that we need to know how big the hammer is. So I guess, to bring it into some focus from my mind, the situation we're dealing with is poor at best. And how are we? So I guess, what do we need to do? And what are we going to do? That's basically my takeaway from today's great presentations. Instead of answering a lot of questions for me, it created a lot more questions to try and figure out ways to gather the information necessary to make a very difficult decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Carpenter. Commissioner Zarnowitz.
Yes, in listening to this and seeing the different presentations, which were all excellent, and I appreciate all the staff time that went into them, and Guy Norman's efforts here, and that you're still here. It seems, I concur with Commissioner Wall that we have to raise the bar above just meeting the escapement for ESA species. And we may have reached all the things we can do without removing the dams, but there are also, I think, minor tweaks that could be done in the meantime, some to improve or I guess reduce the mortality through fishing, commercial and recreational, and not necessarily to reduce the amount of fishing, but to require the gear that will reduce that mortality. And it looks like Oregon probably needs to work harder on getting the alternate methods of commercial harvest, such as the the experiments that are going on the Washington side. And those are some minor things that might help, but at least we'll keep the harvest of what we can harvest of the hatchery fish going without damaging the existing fish. So that would be one minor tweak, but the rest, working harder on habitat. We are reestablishing our habitat division, which the people who have been working on all the efforts related to habitat, maintaining protection of water, fill removal issues, and other issues along those lines that affect fish habitat have been working hard, but now they'll have a back, again, the division of their own to work together on it. So that hopefully will help in the agency's efforts over time. But I think one of the key things is to find the way to raise that bar and still keep the fisheries going, but to raise the escapement of the ESA species so that they can naturally repopulate as much as possible.
Thank you. We also have a couple more hands up. Commissioner Anderson, and then Commissioner McIsaac, and then Commissioner Woolley.
Yeah, just a brief comment with regard to escapement. And, I think we need to be very cognizant and clear that increasing escapement does not in and of itself increase productivity. And so, if you have habitat that isn't producing, then that's not going to yield what you think it's going to yield. So a lot of our plans we have a lot of plans in a lot of places that are based on habitat assessments, and the exploitation rates and the like are all calculated using our best knowledge. So just, it may feel good to say we're going to increase the escapement and get to more fish produced, but if it was that easy, we'd be doing it. So I think that we need to be dialed in as to what we're talking about here. I think we use ESA language when we're talking about our various fish management and the like, and that can appear to be that we're only managing to the ESA low level. We're not managing to the ESA low level. It's a metric that we use. And I think that it sometimes undermines perhaps what we are doing in terms of actual recovery planning. So I just say that, and we can have more discussion about that.
Thank you, Commissioner Anderson. Commissioner McIsaac.
Thank you, Chair. Well, a few thoughts here. Commissioner Baker brought up the question of what are our opportunities and what are our limitations. I did appreciate Tucker Jones's characterization of how much more room we can turn the dial on conservation, and your characterization that maybe the sponge has been wrung out on that. I have that feeling as well, but I think there's a lot more that we can do. With regard to raising the bar, I completely agree with that and what you said about that. I think that while we're just a subset of the Washington commissioners and can't speak for the full commission, the new policy that Washington did adopt does speak for the full commission, and I think it's in full support of doing that. And I'll read here from one of the phrases out of our new policy about hatchery and natural production goals, and it says, The department shall work towards the general goal to increase hatchery and natural production of salmon and steelhead in the Columbia Basin for the purpose of perpetuating a magnitude of abundance more consistent with historic abundance. So more consistent with historic abundance, I think, is fully in support of moving in that direction that you've just mentioned. And so I think we're together on that. Our new policy does mention the task force, the Columbia River Basin Task Force, in at least a couple spots. So I think we're, from my perspective, I would say I'm certainly together on that. And I think our commission has got some things to make me think that from the full commission perspective. In terms of where can we go from here on this? What can be done? What are our limitations? Commissioner Zarnowitz mentioned that we have a lot more we can do. Improving fisheries is one example. And I think as we move on these meetings through time, that if we can get to regulatory and policy concurrency on fishery management, that will be a thing. While it might not fall in complete sync with the conservation thing, it will link up to, if we set a higher bar and fisheries are managed consistent with achieving that bar, that's an important thing to do. We just had a governor's veto of a buyback provision that was vetoed the time before. And the governor's statement at that time was that maybe the commission ought to sit down with the state of Oregon and talk about buyback. And so that's an example of where I think we can move forward on fisheries together. But all in all, the spreadsheet that was prepared here on conservation does show that we're pretty well together on all the key conservation things. And so that's a good thing. And I think we can end up getting there on fisheries too. But where do we go from here in terms of opportunities? I think that after hearing Mr. Norman's presentation, that the commissions could lend their spirit and their tongues in favor of that process. Inside that complicated diagram was something to do with getting started. While in terms of Commissioner Baker's question about what are our limitations, I don't know that I see that the Washington Commission sitting in that forum that develops recommendations. I think that's a limitation. We have a lot of staff involved in the basin hydro business now already. But if we can give support at the commission level for that process to go forward, I think that's one thing that we could do. But all in all, I think on the conservation side of things, it's a good thing that we're so close together already. And if we continue to bring up the fisheries part of it, I think in the end, there is room to make things better for fish runs and fisheries on the Columbia River. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation. I look forward to continuing it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Could I ask one quick follow-up, just in terms of what the last thing you talked about? You're thinking in terms of eventually, not after today, but eventually some sort of letter or other form of communication giving voice to our support for what the collaborative is doing. Am I reading you right?
Yes, you're reading that right. Now, this is a subcommittee, a group of each commission, so we're not speaking for our full commission. We'll have to bring this thought back to our full commission, but we're so close together now, it appears that I think that'd be a strong likelihood. And I think that based on the presentations here today and the support for making the bar higher and the support for all of this stuff, it would seem to me that we should be able to introduce that to our full commissions and hope that could happen.
Thank you. Vice Chair Woolley.
Okay, thank you. One advantage of speaking later is that almost everything, all my thoughts have been covered by just about everyone. But I would just, getting back, and well, thank you, Commissioner Baker, for helping us to keep coming back to where the rubber meets the road, because I know this is why your commission wanted to talk with us in the first place. So, and I do agree that it's been important to talk about our shared conservation goals. And I do believe that we're very close, which addresses the first challenge question that you gave us. What does conservation mean? And I think that we're quite close on that. Your second question, what to be bold about? we've heard different emphases from different commissioners. From Commissioner Anderson, talked about habitat. Commissioner McIsaac talked about hatchery production. So we're getting back to those 4 H's again, and it sounds like those are the areas to examine about where to get bold about. And what I'm hearing from you, Commissioner Baker, is maybe you'd like us to have some sort of consensus toward the end of the meeting of what are the most important areas to focus on, and what should be maybe our top priority and second priority and third priority, which is difficult to do. But I just wanted to make sure that we're talking about aspects of your challenge questions, and are we getting toward some responses and some resolution that may be what you're looking for. So there's those, and of course down the line, then it gets to more sort of micro solutions that are a part of Washington's policy. And they're talking about alternative gear and safe areas and those sorts of things. And we put those discussions off to the side for now for real good reasons. But again, toward the end of this process, we'll get into those, we'll likely get into those details. So I just want to circle back with you, Commissioner Baker. Are we getting closer to where you were hoping this discussion would go?
Vice Chair Baker.
Well, first thing I want to say, Greg, is this is really not my call, but I hope you reconsider your decision to move on to other issues or and not stay on this group, because you are a pretty important part of this group as far as I'm concerned. Yes, this is what I'm trying to do is hear from the 7 of us about what our conservation goals are. This is primarily because the talking past each other is that the Oregon Commission, all the rules, everything I read was very heavily geared toward conservation. Our policy on Columbia River does have a whole lot about conservation in it, but it is more focused on orderly fisheries specifically. And so it seemed to me that, at least listening to Oregon, that we needed to get some shared goals on conservation before we can get to orderly fisheries. With that said, so turning to the chart, I think I've heard everyone say that we need to raise the bar. I'm not sure how far we need to raise the bar, what the consensus is on that, but listening to Mr. Norman, that middle green area seemed like a pretty good place. So if we're going to try to come up with a concurrent policy on objectives, Oregon's currently, this isn't even where Don went on it, which was even deeper into this, but Oregon's first subsection of their rule says to promote the recovery of ESA listed species. Washington's purpose number 1 of our policy says to achieve conservation, preservation, recovery, protection, and perpetuation goals. So those are 2 different standards, but they essentially say the same thing. Are we suggesting here that we need a higher bar, and should we set that higher bar out in either our policy, our rule, or our letter? Whatever we're going to agree on is my question. Greg, at a previous meeting, you had a little minute of frustration and said you'd like to get past talking and get to action. And that hit me because in all things that we do, there's an awful lot of talking. So my question to the group is should we try to, as we're going through this conversation, come up with a list that we can circulate amongst ourselves and then eventually put to the rest of our respective commissions that have objectives that we're trying to meet? And if so, does anyone want to try to draft them? And if not, then I will. So that's my question. Do we want to do more than just say that we want to raise the bar?
Barbara, I think we absolutely do. I think we have to put our thoughts down and our guidance in some written format so we can go back to our respective commissions, seek their input, and come up with a cooperative statement of the bi-state issue going forward. I could elaborate on it, but I think that's it in a nutshell. So I'll stop, let others talk.
I just want to, excuse me, point out that Mary dropped off. Oh, there she is.
I just came back, and my apologies to everybody. And I dropped off, Commissioner Baker, just as you were summarizing where we were headed. So if people will keep going, I will try to catch up real quickly.
Well, go ahead, Commissioner Anderson.
Yeah, I'm with Larry. I think the idea of putting out some paper and some writing that tries to bind what I think we're talking about today makes, or I say bind, but gets us to look at something in common currency, so that we're not looking at these goals and that goals and these rules and the like, but rather looking at something that might be ours in the future. Makes sense. At the same time, I clearly see this as a multiple plank, multi-prong kind of a relationship and an outcome. I hope that we all feel like we're on the same page. I truly recognize that the conservation is first and foremost, but we also live in the here and now. So I just want to get to that point in this process.
I was waiting for you to say that, Jim, because you've been very consistent on that one. Chair Carpenter.
I have to be off here at 11:30, and I am sorry, but I have to, but I do want to just ask a couple things. I think, Barbara, you taken, working on this idea of a presentation in writing, I think has a lot of value. And Chair Wall, I may be out of my league, but I would ask you, because I think it would be very helpful if Vice Chair Woolley would work in conjunction with Barbara, if that meets with your approval. And Mr. Woolley, I think you need to stay where you are. It's a nice seat. You're a great contributor. And at least if it's your swan song, perhaps you could work with Barbara on conceptually what we're trying to do. Chair Wall, do you have any objection to that if Commissioner Woolley is in agreement?
I would never stand between Greg and more work, but I think that really has to be his choice. And he does have a very large role with the Beaver Work Group and some other things. So I'll leave it to him.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll just say that Barbara and I will get together and talk about this and kind of what the workload looks like. And I think if it's manageable, then I'd be happy to work with you, Barbara, on this.
Thank you for that, Greg. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both. And I think the primary author of our policy was Don. We need to have him in the circle in one way or another. So we've kind of beaten the first one to death, which was the easy one. I'm just looking at the chart that was circulated. There were a couple of additions made to this chart that in the circulation process were dropped off. One of them was the next block, which is recovery of non-ESA listed species. I think we better just leave that one alone for right now, unless somebody has a burning comment, just because it's not on the chart. I wanted to get to hydro for a second, because this is something, it's not a concurrency issue with our current Columbia River policies, but I believe it's something that our states do differently. And I know now that at least the taking down the Snake River dams is something that our leadership has taken divergent paths on. So I'm not sure where to go with it. We've just recently had a communication from Governor Inslee and Senator Murray that they think it's too soon to think about that. So I don't think that the Washington Commission can or has, I think it would be silly of us to creep very far out on that branch until we know more about what our governor is up to, because, you know, yeah, when we talk about limitations, I think that's a pretty clear limitation. But so on hydro though, we have experts on this call. I am not an expert, and I don't really know. When I look at our two policies, we both want to explicitly support additional minimalization of hydro-related fish mortality. Is that enough? Is there more that we should put in our policies than saying that? What say this group?
Well, I agree. That's one of the other H's. And I'm sorry, Don wanted to talk, but I was hoping that one would come up as well, because it's one thing to just say we minimize hydro effects, but you know, what does that mean? What are additional methods? Are there any more additional methods that can be taken to address that? So anyway, I'll turn that over to Commissioner McIsaac with this question.
Well, no, I didn't want to interrupt those thoughts. What I have is very consistent with that. So, you know, the commissions have said in general, we want to do better in that regard. And I think that's a powerful thing for the commissions to both say, and they have said that. In terms of how to get that done, you know, we have other agencies besides the Fish and Wildlife Commissions that are looking into that as well. So Mr. Norman sits for the state of Washington on the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, and they deal with that very same thing as well. So I think it's a good thing for the Fish and Wildlife Commissions to say generally that we can do better. We hope to do better, and we're lending 100% support to doing that. All these briefings about SARs and what kind of improvements can be done are things we ought to get behind. But in terms of limitations, for the commissions to put agenda items on their schedule that get into the intricacies of summer spill or all of the package that was agreed to last year, the next round of the next packages, what exactly are those? And when it gets down to turbine designs and things like that, that's where I would think that our staff expertise and our other agency collaborators should be heavily involved. And so I'm having trouble viewing how the commissions get into detail as opposed to just having a general policy support to do better in that area. And I think we can do better, and we've got to do better in that area if we're saying we want to aim for these higher targets.
Okay, well, I'm seeing Commissioner Anderson and then Commissioner Zarnowitz.
Okay, I think yeah, we have certain obvious limitations, but at the same time, it seems to me that we also have a voice, and I think that voice can be had, and it should be had together in many ways. So I think the idea of coming up with kind of I don't know, not necessarily standards, but certainly metrics or some qualitative articulation of what we're looking for. I mean, probably walks us up to what we can say without getting over our skis. And I think that you know, it's important that we take as much responsibility as we can with our writing. And so I kind of I like the idea of you know, putting it out there and using it as a, you know, as kind of a place for us to try to achieve.
So Jim, I agree with every bit of that. The issue when you're trying to come up with a concurrent policy is what that voice will say. And are you focused on minimizing fish mortality when it comes to dams, or increasing spill, or do you want to ask staff to give us some options? How general do you think we should be on this point?
Well, I'm no expert on all of that, but I think there are probably some pretty well understood fish management, and I use that term broadly, but perspectives out there that we ought to put forth. You know, it isn't simple, you know, one or the other, and you know, it depends on, you know, which system you're talking about, or which or you know, which aspect of the hydro system. But yeah, if there's some good staff work that could be done that would help, that I think they could probably nail it pretty good.
Hey, Commissioner Zarnowitz.
Yeah, I was just thinking of, there's the cold water refuge that Oregon has already implemented, and that's pretty important to survival, and pretty important habitat issue. It looked like Washington was investigating that. It seems like that's some place where we could be concurrent. As a, you know, a detailed area, and it relates to habitat that's crucial for fish. It seems like if we could, I hate to put more work on staff, but identify areas where habitat improvements in the off-channel streams where there's the spawning going on. I think we've probably already identified that by mapping in Oregon through our program there, that we could focus on some of our resources on that, applying additional funds to those type of areas. I know in Oregon that's we have a lot of effort going into that, but perhaps there's always more that could be done.
Thank you, Commissioner Zarnowitz. Yes, on also going back to the chart on thermal angling sanctuaries, Oregon has fairly specific, not only supports the concept and understands the issue, but fairly specific geographical areas that they want to focus on. Is that something, and the Washington policy recognizes that it's an issue and asks for a joint body between Oregon and Washington to be developed to work on this. Those are two very different approaches, but they aren't necessarily non-concurrent. So is this something that we need to wordsmith, or does somebody feel strongly one way or the other? Especially somebody from Washington who, well, first off, it's 11:30. So do we have a bit more time? Do we have 15 or 20 minutes to wrap this up, or do we need to end and take it up next? We're kind of close to getting this one settled though, so I'm hoping that people can stay on a few more minutes.
I apologize that I can't. I have a meeting here at the house I have to deal with. So I want to make sure I reach out to everyone involved, the staff, wonderful job, commissioners, and each and every one of you. And I'll look forward to catching up with a number of you. Thank you so much.
Commissioner Anderson?
Yeah, I think the on the thermal refugia, I believe Oregon, manages at least in several of the streams with sanctuaries, and Washington's approach has been more towards, based on the conservation need and the abundance, and doing restrictions to meet the same objectives. I think a report, probably kind of study work group type of approach, makes sense. So I would write towards that, because I don't think we're necessarily geographically in the same situation. For instance, some of our salmon fisheries are in places where it's critical to have salmon fisheries to have the take of some of the hatchery fish. And if we just have a strict refugia policy there, we may not be able to have salmon harvest that reduces hatchery numbers, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I think that it's complex, and I wouldn't think that we could just say we're all going to thermal refugia without having more discussion. But I like the idea of it being in our policy.
Commissioner McIsaac.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. Yeah, I'll just reiterate what Jim said. I think it's a good idea. Our policy calls for sitting down with Oregon and talking about thermal refugia. That's a commitment that was adopted by our full commission. So that's there. We're also interested in talking about several other things that are of the same joint nature. I mentioned the commercial license buyback thing, and there's a couple of others too. So I think that as we continue those discussions, it's important to do that, and that it will. We're all talking about wanting to get to a future spot on some of these things, and it's going to take that kind of dialogue to get there. And so I'm just in favor of scheduling some more meetings of this type, or if there's agreement that a subgroup get started on that. However it is moving forward, I think it's good to continue moving forward on these things. And so again, that's reiterating a little bit what Commissioner Anderson said.
Okay.
Not to wear this out at the moment. I'll just concede that the reason why Oregon got to where we are on these thermal refugias, we have been pushed by angler groups for it. And so I have to give credit where credit is due. We've had consistent testimony over several years of time of the need for these, and we have responded to that. So I don't want to say, we're so great because of this, because we were really pushed to consider this really strongly, and that's why we have the policy. That's why we've been able to set the refugia side that we have.
That's an important point that I tried to make. We're pushed by people who know a lot about this issue all the time, and sometimes it feels like pushing, but most times for me it just feels like filling up my brain with new information. So those groups are really appreciated, basically on all sides of this issue. We have one more big sort of distance in our conservation policies that may or may not be an issue. I do not know, but that is on hatcheries. I think everybody knows we've just gone through a very long process to get a new and improved hatchery policy. And so the one thing that struck me as I was going through comparing the places, the two approaches, is that Oregon policy specifically requires providing additional hatchery fish for release in off-channel areas, either by shifting current production or focusing new production in those areas. Is that non-concurrent with us, or is that something that is more of just a fine-tuning of the policies? And I'm going to have to leave it to people who know more than me to answer that question. Come on, somebody knows the answer to that question.
I think that, this is Mary, I think may need to get staff to help us answer it. I don't look at that as a huge area of non-concurrency. I think it's an area where we need to look at how much we were able to do of what people expected and see if we are concurrent in meeting expectations as a starting place.
And go ahead, Don.
Well, I was just going to say that I would agree. I don't know that this is a huge gap in terms of our approaches on this. Oregon has been consistently strong on setting goals for releases in the Youngs Bay area and down below. Our policy talks with working with Oregon on that matter, and also access Washington fisheries, fishing folks to that area. The Washington policy also talks about in areas where it can be safely done for wild fish to release more fish that would help on pursuing these elevated goals and help on killer whale prey and have shirt-tail benefits to fisheries in various spots. And there are many locations in the Columbia River where that can be done. So I don't know that when I look at that spreadsheet, I don't know that I see a huge gap in our approaches. They're consistently to have hatchery releases done in a manner that in times and areas that don't cause problems for wild fish. And the safe areas are certainly one. There are others, and so I think we can come together on that one. I don't view it as a big policy gap right now. That's my perception anyway.
All right.
Before we leave this, one of them where it looks like you put it on the chart, and that is climate change. Did you already talk about that one?
No, no. Climate change is an area where we have a blank in our policy, which isn't to say that we've ignored it, but what is to say is that we haven't spent the time to condense everything that we're doing in regards to the uncertainties of the future of the climate and reduce it to a rule, as have you. So I think what we'll need to do on the Washington side is review your rule and see if there's either something that we haven't done that we need to do, or just assume it's a non-concur, it's not an issue of concurrence because, well, because we don't have conflicting rules.
Right. And I absolutely agree with you that we don't have conflicting rules. And I don't even think of it in terms of concurrency so much as I think of it as today's circumstances. Both of us have to talk about it, and it's, our staffs bring it up and talk about all of these other issues in the context of climate change and the things that we have to deal with under today's conditions with ocean conditions and climate change. And so it seems to me that it's one we absolutely need to talk about it because it is the context that these others are in. And so I really don't think of it as non-concurrence, but absolutely as something that's critical context. And so it needs to stay sort of front and center. So it may need to be handled a little differently than the others are, but it's one that we absolutely should be talking about. And it would help us, as we're hearing from staff on these various pieces, to be incorporating climate change into those discussions.
Okay, Commissioner McIsaac.
Yeah, just quickly on that matter. Last September, when the commission adopted, the Washington Commission adopted the new policy, at the onset of that meeting, there was introductory discussion about an amendment that would have climate change addressed. As it turned out, at that particular meeting, we ran out of time. That amendment did not get put on the table. But the intent was to try to do that. And from my perspective, I detected strong sympathy at the Washington Commission to consider such a thing. It's not in there right now, but I think that's an opportunity if we can get to a point here this year where we're looking at concurrent policy and regulatory approaches, that would be a key policy approach that I think we could get to a high degree of concurrency on. What's already in the Oregon statute, perhaps you all might want to modify that a little bit. And like I said, we were in a position of thinking about an amendment to our policy to directly get to that. So I think that's a signal of openness. And so I'm hoping that later in the year, when we get to firmer discussions about a joint policy and regulatory approach, that would be right in the middle of it.
All right. To try and wrap up this meeting, I think here's the plan as I've heard it. Greg and I are going to sit down and see what we can bang out with Don's assistance. The reason Don is more than helpful in this regard is he knows our policy inside and out, and it may be that we can do a crosswalk, or better yet, write something out that that is shorter than our policy, but maybe a bit more elaborate than your rule. And I think we will try to do that before the next meeting. Since I haven't seen anybody storming out or anything, I assume we're going to have another meeting. Our staffs have suggested having July 28th be that date. So I'm just throwing that out there for us to consider. If anybody has any huge problems with that date, please let, probably to begin, well, I think Chair Carpenter or Chair Wall know, probably also our able administrative assistants, Nikki and Michelle. Between now and then, a few of us are going to get together and see if we can draft something that that can be presented in advance of the next meeting, but for discussion, hopefully a fairly short discussion on shared conservation goals. After that, what I understood, and Larry's off, but what I understood, the next meeting would be geared toward more of a discussion of orderly fisheries. What I heard earlier was that we would start with gear and go on to allocation, which would probably bleed into the next and maybe final meeting. And then we also need a list of the, not details, but sort of ancillary issues that Don referred to, which includes buybacks. It probably, a lot of the gear discussions are in there. That's the barbless hooks and the nets and all of that. So we need to keep track and make sure that we don't miss something that needs to be in this policy, and especially if we are not concurrent with it. And we should have those lists for our review at the beginning of next meeting. So beginning of next meeting, we review what we came up with today. We talk about at least gear, and we talk about ancillary issues that we need to make sure we don't lose in the process. Does that sound acceptable to anyone? And have I missed something huge?
I don't think so.
Did you say the 28th is a possible date that came up?
Yes,
July?
Yes.
Okay.
That gives us 8 weeks or so to get this all together, which it shouldn't take 8 weeks. The other thing that I wanted to say is one of my objectives in this process is for us to start coming up with our own, we've heard from staff, now we need to reduce this to writing. I had hoped to, as part of that, not increase the workload on staff any more than we already have for the last, as long as I've been on the commission. So if we're talking about things like a joint body on thermal refugia, and Don, you said you had other things you would like that joint working group to work on. It's my feeling that we need to have staff help present us with options, but I don't know that we need a lot of long briefings with PowerPoints and all of that anymore. maybe we could have that joint body be essentially a meeting like this where they participate and aren't expected to come up with a bunch of work product. Is that what you were thinking, Don?
Yes, yeah, that's very consistent with it. We've got a list of 2 or 3 of those things where our policy says, can we sit down with Oregon and begin those policy discussions? So I think no PowerPoints, but an introductory piece of business without a big staff workload is entirely consistent with moving that forward.
Okay, well, we're going to need to work on what we mean by we and what we mean by sit down with Oregon in between these next few weeks as well. And perhaps we can circulate some emails or something as we get that figured out. But let's get it figured out and get it done, okay?
I would like to actually, yes, okay, I think that sounds good, Barbara, and we can move forward that way. I do want to be careful with the Oregon conversation on its own, that what Oregon has reiterated 3 times in meetings at the commission level is we really want to focus on conservation first and get that settled. And I think we've taken some big steps, with great thanks to you for moving that forward, Barbara. But I do want to make sure that we stay true to that direction from our commission and really keep conservation and increasing these runs as the focus, and not move immediately away from those things back to all of the conversations that we were having before. So I would like to just talk a little, before the next meeting. I think we should make sure that we stay true to that.
All right, well, I think I hear what you're saying, and we will need to plan an agenda for the next meeting.
And staff, I just wanted, and on that front, and I'm sorry I got off, I'm not sure what happened with my internet, but staff is trying to look for a time to have the agenda planning meeting as well.
Okay, so the question that we have then is if agreeing on this conservation shared goals, which actually I'm very optimistic that we can do. So, but is that a condition precedent to continuing with our with the other discussions on orderly fisheries? That's the question that we're going to have to decide. I think that what we were looking at is coming up with something, having it hopefully maybe edited and then agreed to on conservation goals, which will be useful regardless of whatever else we can agree or not agree on, I believe. And then but we will need to plan an agenda for the next meeting, and hopefully there won't be any glitches getting there.
I don't think there will, Barbara. I just want to make sure, because I missed part of it, that I've stayed in line with what we had all been talking about on the Oregon side. It sounds to me like we have made great progress on the conservation goals, and that we're very close. And I appreciate what people how far we got, and I think we're very close on that one. So I think we can begin to talk about those other things. I just want to make sure we don't lose the conservation pieces in that.
Okay, I am pretty sure we're not going to lose it, but thank you, Chair Wall. Does anybody have any concluding statements that they want to make? And that includes the directors, Mr. Norman, or any of the commissioners? Or just, I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, well then that was my moderating part. Mary, I think I'll leave it to you to do whatever concluding statements and adjourn the meeting.
Well, I think we're pretty much there and ready to conclude. We were going to talk about next steps. There were a couple requests from a couple commissioners to talk about next steps, and we just did it. The only other thing I would add is that staff have been looking at other dates, and beyond the 7/28 date, maybe 10/27. So October 27th as the one after that, just so we can start getting these on the agenda.
So in terms of those dates, Chair Wall, I imagine there are some people listening who are interested in this year 2021's fishery allocation. We have heard that we should move quicker than we're moving. I'm pretty sure that is not going to happen. So is it our common understanding that we as commissioners are still not sure what's going to happen in the fall, and we will be working with our directors who we have delegated that authority to decide? Or is there something else we should be telling the people who are very, very interested in the answer to that question?
Well, we do, yes, that is the position we're in, and we do have a legislative session about to wind up here that also could have an impact that I think we're all watching, and then we can move, I think, fairly quickly to figure that piece out.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, I'm looking at Kurt and Kelly's little blocks sitting next to each other, both hidden and muted. Do either of you have anything you want to add to any of this?
Well, I would say that Kurt and I have been talking generally about the seasons, and as the run updates come out, I think we've got it handled, is the way I would describe it. The rest of it, I'm encouraged that my takeaway was, especially on the conservation side, it's already been iterated, but we are so close to the same, particularly through my lens, which of concurrency, which is not inconsistent, not contradictory, as opposed to verbatim. I hope that's a fairly easy step to get through, and I think it will. So I'm encouraged by that, and I think that would be it for me.
Mr. Melcher?
Oh, yeah, I agree. And I would just remind you that the fall Chinook allocations are actually already concurrent. And so that makes the discussion a little bit easier for the 2021 fisheries side. And I think the fall fishery planning is already well underway based on the concurrent fall Chinook sharing.
Chair Wall.
I would say thank you all, and we are adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.